It was January of 2022. I was bored at home between semesters of college and I needed something to do. I'd heard of this show on Netflix that had stunning animation, tight and impressive writing, and apparently even some leftist political commentary. So I checked it out. And I both was and wasn't impressed. I enjoyed Arcane's first season. I fell in love with the characters of Vi and Ekko. They're still my favorites now. And I thought the animation was indeed gorgeous and the writing pretty great. The politics, though, well, this is a tweet I'd made on February 4th of 2022, a couple of weeks after watching the show. I just think the whole plot with Piltover versus Zaun was poorly done. First we have Caitvi, which I love, which is literally propaganda. Then we have Silco, who is supposed to be fighting for liberation, and yet he's now a drug dealer, I guess. The only ones who seem to be doing anything helpful are maybe Ekko and the Firelights, but I don't know. But the whole framing of Zaun's problems just being Silco and not, their constant oppression by Piltover is just plain bad. As you can see, I did not hold any fantasies that the show would be a leftist masterpiece. There are things about these tweets I think differently about now, like Silco's character and what he represents, or Caitvi because I don't like it at all anymore, not its canon version at least, but in general, what's important to note here is that I wasn't entirely convinced by the show's leftism. However, there are many that were. One of the reasons I was not convinced was because I knew that my favorite character, Vi, was a cop in League of Legends, which is the game that Arcane is based on. Personally, I felt, and still do feel, that Vi becoming a cop makes no sense given the character we were presented with in Season 1, especially its first two acts. But I knew that since Arcane was a League of Legends show, there was a high chance that she'd end up as an enforcer. And then the trailer for Season 2 dropped, and I saw Vi in that accursed uniform, and I knew all was lost, and my excitement for Season 2 was a double-edged sword. But I never could have thought it would be this bad. Character assassinations left and right, zero accountability for a character instituting martial law, absurd and atrocious pacing, the utter defilement and destruction of my favorite character, and more. From my understanding, because I don't really watch video essays, there have already been essays and videos out the ass about Arcane Season 2, and I'm sure that there are probably ones about what I'm going to talk about here today. But I still wanted to throw my hat in the ring to talk about Arcane, both its first and second seasons, because I'd like to discuss why Arcane was always going to turn out this way, to a certain degree. In other words, this video is about why Arcane was always centrist. Before we could talk about the politics of Arcane, I think it's important that we're all on the same page. Words like centrism, leftism, conservatism, etc. carry different meanings around the globe, and even across different people, so I'd like to discuss what I mean by the different political terms I'll be referring to and using in this video. First things first, I'm analyzing Arcane using the left-right political spectrum. Nothing much to say here, this is just a way of classifying political ideologies, and the key differentiating issues are social equality versus social hierarchy. This is the most common political spectrum, so I'm sure most watching are familiar with it. Alright, let's talk terms. I'll start with right-wing, because I think that this is probably the easiest term to conceptualize and explain. I'll also be talking about it the least, so might as well get it out of the way. So, right-wing politics, or the right, are associated with conservative political thought. These political ideologies support maintaining the status quo and find social inequality and hierarchical society to be inevitable and natural. The right values order, social cohesion, and patriotism. The right is also traditionally associated with reactionary politics, which desire to see society revert back to its previous political state, status quo ante. One form of right-wing extremism is fascism. There's many different definitions of fascism, but for right now I'll just provide the definition used by Merriam-Webster Dictionary, which defines fascism as a populist political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, and that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. On the opposing side of right-wing is left-wing, and I'll be talking about leftism a lot, so I want to be real clear by what I mean here, since there's been a lot of co-opting and masquerading going on that dilutes what leftism actually is. So, what are left-wing politics? Leftism supports and tries to achieve social equality and egalitarianism through making radical changes to society. Now, contrary to what might be popular belief, especially in the United States where it definitely is popular belief, leftism is not liberalism. I repeat, liberalism and leftism are not at all the same thing. Liberalism is actually a centrist position, maybe center-left, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. As opposed to the reactionary right, the left is traditionally associated with revolutionary politics, which support an abrupt, rapid, drastic change in society. That doesn't necessarily have to be combined with progressivism, but since we're talking about leftism here, when I speak of revolutions, I'm going to be talking about revolutions with the purpose of making society more egalitarian. Now, for this video, when I talk about leftism, unless I say otherwise, I will largely be referring to the political positions of the most extreme forms of leftism, so communism, anarchism, liberatory politics, etc. Alright, lastly, let's get a definition for centrism ironed out. So, centrism is, of course, what's between the right and the left. Being in the middle, it's a bit of a compromise between these two political anchors. For example, one thing that centrism loves is the idea of gradual social change, as opposed to the right's desire for things to stay the same and the left's desire for things to change right here, right now. You can think of centrism as the right but more progressive, or the left but more regressive. Centrists support social hierarchy, but with more equal distribution of resources than the right. A big word with centrists is reform, as in reforming institutions rather than abolishing them, like a leftist would say. One centrist ideology is liberalism. Now, I could be here all day defining liberalism, because this is a very loaded word with a shit ton of different meanings, because of the existence of classical liberalism and modern liberalism. To save us all some time, I'm only going to be discussing modern liberalism, which is also known as social liberalism, and when I discuss centrism throughout this video, unless I say otherwise, I'll be referring to modern liberal ideology. Liberalism as an ideology essentially concerns itself with the idea of freedom, where protecting and enhancing individual freedom is the central concern of politics. Modern liberalism believes that the biggest threat to individual freedom is poverty, since it limits the choices people have in life and prevents them from living to their fullest potential. As such, modern liberals believe that the government should intervene in economic and social issues like poverty or welfare. Modern liberalism still believes in a market economy, differentiating it from socialism or communism. And then remember, as a centrist ideology, modern liberalism is still very much for reform and gradual change in the midst of all of this. So for liberals, revolution is a no-no, and they prefer for things to be peaceful and orderly. As those of you watching likely remember, Arcane begins with a rather harrowing scene of two kids walking across a bridge covered in fire and ash, clearly the tail end of some kind of conflict. Dead bodies line the bridge. We see someone get killed by a person in uniform, what we'll later find out is an enforcer, the police force in the Arcane world. One of the kids sings a lullaby while we hear screams in the background. They see a large man pummeling an enforcer with gauntlets, and he directs them towards the bodies of their parents. The man drops his gauntlets, clearly a statement of him choosing not to fight, and he takes the kids into his arms, walking them away from the bridge, and the older child stares at the masked enforcers on the bridge as well as the skyline of the city above them, with clear rage and hatred. This is our introduction to the show. This is the taste that we as viewers are given as to what Arcane is going to be about. It sets the tone, it draws viewers in. Above all, this scene highlights two things. One, this show is going to be about these two sisters. I'm sure I don't need to talk about how Season 2 utterly failed on that front. And then two, this show is going to be about the conflict between these two cities. This I will be talking about, of course. For this section of the video, I want to highlight what the show tells us about Zaun and Piltover right off the bat, during the first act of Season 1, especially Episode 1, because this is the heart of the politics of Arcane. So first we have Episode 1, which is of course the most important episode when it comes to establishing the dynamic between Zaun and Piltover. The first taste we get of this is, as I said, the opening scene. In that scene, we learn that the conflict between the regions is violent, or has gotten to that point. We learn that Piltover is the side that has the police in their pocket. Notice how all the Zaunites on the bridge had hardly any weapons and no armor compared to the full body armor of the enforcers. Piltover is at an advantage. Piltover has police and military power. This is only further further shown in the very next scene, which takes place years later, where Vi, Powder, Milo, and Clagger go to Piltover for their heist. This scene tells us a lot as well. The plot, the environment, and the dialogue,
"You think anyone topside's going hungry?"
all paint a picture that Zaun is poor and Piltover is wealthy, that they are two regions of one city, even though we all just refer to them as two cities. And when the crew goes back down to Zaun, we further get an idea of the state of Zaun's destitution. It seems to be a rundown, overcrowded place, but also vibrant and lively. We see a brothel, which many of the things I have to say about that are better left for later. Later on in the episode, we learn that Vander has a deal with the sheriff of the enforcers, that they stay out of each other's business, or actually that the enforcers don't come down to Zaun as long as Zaunites don't go into Piltover. A pretty one-sided deal, but I digress. So overall, episode 1 lets us know that things are tense between Zaun and Piltover. There was at least one violent conflict between them in the past, and Piltover holds the power over Zaun. Episode 1 also shows us that Piltover and Zaun, or the Undercity, are separated by a river. This is a change from the way that League of Legends depicts the two cities, where Piltover is literally on top of Zaun, and this change says a lot about the show's politics as well, but I'll discuss that in a later section of this video. Moving on to episode 2, this episode really introduces us to some of the other key factors fleshing out the world of Piltover, namely the Council, which is the governing body of Piltover. Piltover's council is very privileged and very prejudiced. We get scenes with the Kiramans and Mel Medarda showing the wealth of Piltover. The council very clearly does not give a shit about the Undercity, only caring about keeping a feeling of safety for Piltover. We also see more of the enforcers, and one of them uses what is very obviously a derogatory term, trencher, towards a Zaunite, and we also see unnecessary force, or at least intimidation, from the enforcers, given that 4 of them are questioning a Zaunite who is already restrained by one of them, and we see another one push a Zaunite very harshly. And when that Zaunite spits on Marcus's shoe, they are thrown into Vi and Co.'s hideout, and their hideout is then searched with no due process like a warrant of any kind. We also don't see Vi and Co. complain about that little fact, leading us to believe that this is typical and perhaps just simply the way things go. Grayson's little line in this episode about how they've frozen commerce for half the district again demonstrates Piltover's economic power over the Undercity, a power that is enforced by their police. So, you with me so far? The first act of Arcane sets up 2 very unequal societies between Zaun and Piltover. Piltover has power over Zaun, and the enforcers are their tools to enact that power. Piltover looks down on Zaun. Piltover is wealthy and privileged, while Zaun is destitute. The rest of Season 1 tells us all of this yet again in so many different ways. For example, Vi's imprisonment. She's thrown into still water with no process, no paperwork, no crime, no trial. And given that Caitlyn doesn't even react to this information at first, I have to assume that this isn't even an uncommon occurrence. At the very least, the fact that it can happen is more than enough evidence of the kind of extreme authority enforcers can wield against Zaunites. And we can compare this to what Jayce went through in episode 2. Jayce's holding cell had a bed, blankets, books, a window, a table. Stillwater is Stillwater. Also, Jayce got a trial. Vi got nothing. The rest of Season 1 also gives us plenty more examples of the prejudice that Piltovians have towards Zaunites. And then there's a couple of other small things we learn as well, such as Zaun not really having anything in the way of medical treatment outside of Shimmer, the poisonous gas that's in the mining fissures, and that Silco blackmails Marcus to make sure enforcers don't poke around in his business, but deal with his enemies. This is so he can consolidate his control of the Undercity as he's biding his time to force the independence issue with Piltover. And then of course the season ends with Jinx killing Silco and blowing up the council when they vote for Zaun's independence. I've given a pretty detailed recap about what Season 1 said about the dynamic between Piltover and Zaun, and we already know that Season 1 was loved for a variety of reasons: the character writing, the fight scenes, the animation, the great use of music, but a lot of people also loved the political commentary of the show, or what we thought the political commentary was. So why did people think Season 1 was leftist, or that it at least contained some left-leaning political commentary? Well, first, there was the opening scene. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but this is a very clear and obvious depiction about the brutality of policing, and like I said earlier, it tells us that the show is going to be handling this topic. Given what else happens during Season 1, this seems like a fair assumption, so that's the first reason. Another reason was Vi's character, specifically some of the lines of dialogue she had. She was a burgeoning little revolutionary in Act 1, more on this later, and then in Act 2 and 3, she was reading Pilties left and right. She calls Caitlyn out for being an enforcer, she calls out the council's inaction, being why someone like Silco was allowed to rise in Zaun, she calls Jayce out for threatening to send her to jail, she calls attention to the relations between Piltover and Zaun. Considering that Vi was essentially our follow-along character, kind of, having her be the one to provide all this commentary was a good sign for Arcane's leftist politics. It also helped that Vi was so different than her League counterpart, who from my understanding is, or at least was at some point, just police brutality personified. That they made all of these changes to her seemed to indicate that perhaps this show would be giving a take on her character much more steeped in political commentary. Next is Ekko's entire character. Now, Little Man actually is a revolutionary, a collectivist. Ekko's firelights are as much vigilantes as they are almost a mutual aid commune of sorts. Ekko has the will to fight for his people and will put aside his own reservations if it means guaranteeing their safety. He also reads Caitlyn for filth, which is always a plus. He criticizes both Silco and the Enforcer/Piltover, and like Sevika, he is a character that is clearly interested in the well-being of Zaun. Then there was Caitlyn. Her arc in Season 1 was essentially that of a privileged person becoming an ally to a struggle of the marginalized, and many speculated that Season 2 would see her go to the next level of allyship, which could have entailed many things, each its own shade of leftist. Caitlyn utilizing political power, her abandoning the Enforcers, her becoming sheriff and reforming the Enforcers. This last one would be centrist, but let's just say center-left. These are just a few examples, but the general idea is that Caitlyn seemed to be going down the path of a character who would play a critical role in Zaun gaining an equal treatment, independence, and or liberation. And then how about Silco? In Season 1, Silco was a very nuanced character. On the surface, Silco appears to have some radical revolutionary ideas, wanting independence for Zaun. The problem is that with the portrayal of him we're shown, his fight against Piltover is born out of hatred, not love for his own people. That is why he could so easily oppress his own people and poison them with Shimmer. Kind of. I'll talk about Shimmer more later. He wants to be in control of the same oppressive system, or at least recreate it in Zaun. He is not for true liberation. This is the leftist interpretation of his character, a cautionary tale about why revolutionary politics are necessarily born out of love, not hate. And this interpretation fits quite nicely into the way that Vander's character was also interpreted by leftists. Because Vander could also be interpreted as a cautionary tale, a tragic character. Vander also used to be a revolutionary, but when the people he cared about died because of the riot on the bridge, leaving 2 kids orphaned, he abandoned the hope that things could change in his grief and self-blame. He internalized the idea that the world they live in is a fixed thing, that the problems in his life are his fault, not Piltover's, and that submitting to Piltover is better than trying to fight against it. His motives are understandable, but in the end he is a revolutionary turned liberal. He represents someone who is broken by Piltover's oppression of him and his people, at least in the leftist interpretation of his character. So, in short, it was very easy to interpret Arcane Season 1 as a leftist or left-leaning show. It presented itself that way. Right? Well, I find that the answer to that question is both yes and no. Before I get into that though, let's discuss how Season 2 portrays the situation between Zaun and Piltover. Well, I guess the first thing I can say is that it does so shittily whenever it bothers to at all. I know that, you know that, we all know that. But let me actually be serious for a second and give a somewhat brief summary as to what goes down. Season 2 begins with the direct aftermath of Jinx's attack against the council. Piltover is not happy, and we get to see lots and lots of prejudice towards Zaunites, including from Caitlyn, as this attack has now changed the trajectory of her character arc from what many of us predicted it would be. More on that later. Once Caitlyn's squad starts pursuing Jinx, because Caitlyn is a Curaman, she has access to the vents in the undercity, allowing her squad to use the Grey, aka a gas weapon, against the undercity. So far, Season 2 is very consistent about the power differential between Zaun and Piltover. The first big shift in this dynamic, at least kind of, comes at the end of Episode 3, when Piltover goes under martial law, with Caitlyn at the helm and Mbessa Medarda, a military general, serving as support. I say kind of when it comes to this shift in dynamic, since as we already saw with Vi, the civil liberties of Zaunites already have a history of being ignored. But anyway, so yes, Piltover goes under martial law with the purpose of keeping the city safe and under control, a fancy way of saying let's oppress Zaun harder. Episode 4, which takes place after an unspecified time skip of at least a few months, establishes that the Enforcers and Noxus forces are actively occupying Zaun, complete with civilian/security checkpoints meant to monitor the movement of Zaunites. We also see the suspension of civilian legal processes in action, as in this episode, Enforcers mass arrest Zaunites attending a rally, including at least one 7-year-old child, sending them all to Stillwater. Stillwater is largely the same prison as we remember it in Season 1, except that Caitlyn has apparently banned the use of the lower levels that are devoid of light, the kinds of quote-unquote inhumane cells that Vi was kept in during her 7-year stint. Episode 4 also has Jinx and Sevika interact with an Enforcer who is terribly incompetent in a scene that brings to mind MCU humor. Episode 6 marks the end of Caitlyn and Mbessa's partnership, and Episode 8 appears to be the actual end of the martial law. Episode 8 is also when the dynamic between Zaun and Piltover becomes something much different than what we've been shown throughout the entire show. Because of the amassing forces against them, Piltover, or Jayce really, pleads with Zaun to help them fight against Mbessa and Viktor. At first, the two Zaunites invited to this discussion, Sevika and Scar, essentially say fuck that and leave, demonstrating the bad blood between the two regions. But through a montage, we see that not every Zaunite feels the same, and a decently sized group of Zaunites cross the bridge and come to Piltover's aid. We are not told why they do this, other than some implications that seeing the Enforcers being nice to them for once influences them in some way. Oh, and then once the battle gets started, the rest of Zaun shows up to help at the 11th hour because bananas. So things between Piltover and Zaun are good enough for Zaun to fight for Piltover, risking their lives, when Piltover has offered them exactly nothing in return. I'm trying not to be snarky, but I don't see how I can't be. And then, of course, there is the final resolution of the show, shown in Episode 9. After the war with Mbessa and Viktor's forces, we see that Zaun gets nothing but a single seat on the council, filled by Sevika. That's it. No independence that we know of, no reparations, not even a guarantee that there will be no enforcers on their streets. It's possible that the show wants us to believe that Zaun has essentially been given the same deal that Silco had gotten at the end of Season 1, where Zaun gets free trade routes, blanket amnesty, and unrestricted access to the Hex Gates, if they're even still operating, just leaving out the part where that deal also outlines Zaun's independence. But Season 2, Episode 9 did not bother showing us that, so the only thing we know for sure is that Zaun has one seat on the council, a seat that will always be outvoted and potentially just voted out the way that Heimerdinger was.
What the hell is even that?
Can you even call this a reformist ending at this point? The ending also implies, given the whole putting differences aside thing, that Zaun and Piltover are entering a new era of peace between the cities. That this peace is entirely unfounded is apparently not a concern of Arcane's. Now, Season 2's ending is dog shit for more reasons than I can count, at least half of them having to do with my children, Vi and Ekko, but whatever the hell this is has got to be one of the biggest. It's an utter mockery of the conflict set up in the very first scene of the very first episode. Except, maybe it isn't. See, there is a reason why we got all this tonal whiplash between Season 1 and Season 2. There is a reason why Season 1 portrayed the Enforcers as a dangerous, corrupt force, while Season 2 portrayed them as incompetent and kind and misled, though Season 1 also did this last one too. There is a reason why the Council is relevant in Season 1 and not in Season 2. There is a reason why war between Piltover and Zaun seems inevitable in Season 1 and easily resolved in Season 2. It is because this was always the end goal. We were never going to see a Zaunite revolution, we were never going to see an independent Zaun, we were never going to see abolition. And yes, each of these were crack dreams for a piece of Western media, but I know people had hope that we'd see them. I personally figured that we'd see, at the very least, equal representation for Zaunites on the council, a reformed enforcer force, and more wealth equality between the cities by the end of the show. These are all pretty liberal resolutions, only slightly left of the center, but we didn't even get any of this. One of them outright just didn't happen, and the other two we have no idea, and there is a reason for everything I've just said. And what is that reason? Well, it's actually pretty simple once you think about it. See, maybe it's not that Season 2 is so incredibly different from Season 1, when it comes to its handling of political ideas anyway. No, it's because Arcane was never actually invested in leftist ideals in the first place. Season 1 was just a lot better at hiding that, the writers far more adept at guiding us to leftist intentions they never actually had. From the very beginning, Arcane put on a masquerade of leftism, a disguise of sorts, window dressing. Any leftist messaging that this show appeared to endorse was either incidental or only supported in the most shallow of ways, and once you realize this, the centrism of Arcane and the show's ultimate trajectory makes complete sense. I first became cognizant of Arcane's leftist farce a few weeks ago, or more like a month ago by now, when this thread by user at SweatViArcane, or Nikki, came across my timeline on Twitter. This is a great thread that I suggest everyone read if you can, because I'm not going to be able to do it justice in this video. So essentially, what Nikki talks about is that Arcane never intended to make a commentary on the police system in general, instead it just carries the aesthetic of a fuck the police theme. For example, the opening scene was only meant to show the enforcers as the people who killed Vi and Jinx's parents, not a systemic tool of oppression Piltover uses against Zaun. The firelights appear to be against Piltover, but they never actually fight any enforcers. Nikki also talks about Vi a lot in this thread, but since I'll be giving my own analysis on Vi, I'll skip over that. But basically, the part of the thread I really want to point out is this tweet right here. The writers wrote the show's political story to reflect its relationships. Piltover's oppression of Zaun is a backdrop, a source of interpersonal tension, not commentary, and I'll be discussing this point a lot when I start analyzing characters, particularly once I start talking about Caitvi. Nikki also discusses Caitvi in this context, so seriously, go check out her thread if you can, it's so good. This thread opened my eyes. It was so obvious. Arcane was never going to end any other way. Arcane was always going to be centrist, and these serious issues that the show drew from were only meant to serve as window dressing for the animation and the interpersonal conflicts. Don't believe me yet? That's fine, because I'm only just getting started. But maybe you don't believe me because I, a random person on the internet, am saying this. That's fine too. You don't have to take my word for it. Why don't we take a look at what Christian Link, Arcane's co-creator, showrunner, and executive producer, has to say about Piltover and Zaun. This right here is Link's pitch for Arcane that he shared on Twitter, though he has since deleted that tweet. I've highlighted the relevant parts for your reading pleasure, but I'll go ahead and read this whole middle section aloud. So, Mr. Link writes about Arcane. At its center is Piltover, the gleaming city full of Da Vinci-esque technology and steampunk wonder. In its underground district Zaun, a society of thieves, smugglers, and makeshift Svengalis defy its law. Haphazard mutative experiments on humans let the underground grow wild and strong. Word on its streets is clear. Fuck Piltover's laws and moral code. It's time to push things a lot further. The people of Piltover need to decide, take back control of its city's underground by violent force and risk a civil war, or let Zaun's dangerous evolutionary advances go their way. It's a story about the clash of morals and ideology, about corruption among the pure and righteousness among the unfortunate. That is certainly a pitch that exists. Alright, let me get serious. This pitch, this elitist centrist thought, is what we can assume guided the production of Arcane. With an attitude like that, there's no reason to be surprised that Arcane ended up this way. This pitch calls Zaun an immoral place with no good people, where righteousness is an exception to the norm. It calls Piltover pure, for God's sakes. This is what the show's co-creator had in mind from the beginning. And notice what is missing from this pitch. The oppression, the commentary, the presence of the police, anything that would be considered leftist in any way, as well as any explanation for Zaun's characteristics that go beyond they're bad people. The leftism was not part of the initial concept, and instead what was is a rather dehumanizing and insulting depiction of the poor. If this pitch was the guiding light of the show, then no wonder Piltover's oppression of Zaun was not handled adequately. With a pitch like this, you'd think the enforcers are the good guys. Hell, there is literally no indication here that Piltover is in the wrong in any way, even though the pitch acts like Piltover's first recourse to solving the situation in Zaun is violence. Apparently that's the right thing to do, according to this pitch. Now, I fully recognize that this is just the pitch for Arcane, meaning that things could have and likely did change during production. However, I still believe that this pitch is relevant for two reasons. First is that Link was perfectly fine putting it out there for everyone to see, derogatory terms and all, which implies to me it must have at least some relevance to the final product. Second is that when you watch Arcane now, this general attitude towards Piltover and Zaun is still very much there, even if buried underneath some of the leftist disguise and the most left-leaning parts of the show's centrism. For example, a lot of Zaun's deterioration, particularly where it's at after the 7-year time skip between Act 1 and Act 2 of Season 1, is blamed on Silco, not Piltover. I fully believe that the execution of Season 2 probably would not have been quite as insulting and awful had Season 2 had more writers, because even though Season 1 was also centrist, as I'll be discussing shortly, at least it was a good piece of television. Season 2 was other dog shit, and the writers they had left were not skilled enough to even execute their own centrist vision in a way that was even remotely palatable or reasonable, making the ending far more insulting than it needed to be. For example, Season 2 introduced elements such as gas weaponry and martial law, and treated them with absolutely none of the seriousness and gravity they deserved. In fact, they were not brought in for commentary at all, just interpersonal conflict and tension between the characters. This is a common theme for just about every political element in Arcane, and I'll get into this a lot once I start talking about each of the characters. Now that I've presented my argument that Arcane was always meant to be centrist, it's time to prove it. Let's revisit Season 1 for a few moments. I want to discuss some of the key moments where the centrist seed was planted in Season 1, and the ways that we as the audience might have dismissed them or interpreted them differently than their centrist truth. Some of these moments and qualities will be the same as the ones I pointed out earlier in the video as reasons why people may have thought this show would be leftist, and this is on purpose. If the show is wearing a leftist masquerade, it makes sense that some of the things we thought were leftist were actually centrist all along. Alright, so what were those moments that the centrist seed was planted in Season 1? Well, one of the biggest moments, one of the moments that a lot of people caught on to, is Vander's speech to Vi in Episode 2. If you may recall, this speech came after Vi found out about Vander's deal with the Enforcers, and she was very angry about it, since she wants to take the fight to Piltover. And when Vi tells him this, Vander says something cryptic about having heard this talk before, and then we cut to the full conversation between Vi and Vander after Vander brings her to the bridge, the same bridge where Vi and Powder found their dead parents. I'll let y'all listen to what Vander has to say here.
I was angry, just like you. I led us across this bridge, thinking things could change. If I hadn't, your parents would still be alive. I know you want to hurt the Topsiders for what they've done to us, but who are you willing to lose? Milo? Clagger? Powder? Nobody wins in war, Vi.
This is a centrist, anti-revolutionary sentiment. Notice the way Vander presents Vi's desire to fight Piltover as one that comes out of hate, not love for her sister or community, despite the fact that she just said it came from that motive right before this. This makes Vi's wish to fight seem immature and short-sighted. Vander brings up the potential consequences of fighting against Piltover, but this ignores the fact that people in Zaun are already dying from inaction against Piltover. Vi mentions Zaunites going hungry in Episode 1. Vi would have died in Stillwater if it weren't for the plot. We know that Zaun is an environmentally unhealthy place with little in the ways of medical care. People are dying. The show tries not to show us this by having the only time we see Piltover actively killing Zaunites be after they have apparently already initiated a violent confrontation, but it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together. Piltover's oppression kills, just like oppression kills in the real world in so many ways that go beyond a direct act of murder. Like I said earlier, many people took Vander's character as a cautionary tale, as the result of constant oppression breaking a person until they've internalized it and become a proponent of the oppression they used to struggle against. Season 2 proves without a doubt that this was not the intended interpretation. No, we were supposed to take Vander at face value. He is older and wiser, and Vi is younger and mistaken. And what does Vander's speech to Vi do in the end? Vi decides to sacrifice herself by trying to turn herself into the Enforcers to protect her siblings. Vander's speech snuffs out her revolutionary spark and makes her decide to act by the Enforcers' rules. And this ain't a knock on Vi, that's my girl, but it's true. Vander's speech makes Vi stop thinking that things can be better, so she does the only other thing she can think to do to protect her family, no longer believing that taking the fight to Piltover is the best way. To me, this loss of radical hope is devastating, but to the show, this is Vi embracing realism. It is her making the right decision, sad only in that Vi is self-sacrificing to a fault. Another quality of Season 1 that, in hindsight, makes the centrist direction of the show obvious is in what things it chooses not to give commentary on. For example, there is never, not for one moment, a critique of capitalism, and that is because Arcane goes out of its way to not show Piltover's exploitation of Zaun. For one thing, we're never shown a Piltovian that is directly invested in Zaun's exploitation. We get moments where this can be implied, such as many of the counselors' outraged reactions at the idea of Zaunite independence, but there is never a moment where we even see how these wealthy people have gotten their money. And remember what I said earlier about how Arcane changed the relative locations of Zaun and Piltover to being across the river from each other instead of Zaun being literally under Piltover like it is in League of Legends? Yeah, that's not a coincidence. In League of Legends, Zaun as a city came first, but in the construction of the Sun Gates, huge access ways vital for mercantile business, many parts of Zaun sunk, and afterwards Piltover was established by the merchant families who got wealthy from the construction of the Sun Gates. Now, because League of Legends is League of Legends, Piltover's exploitation of Zaun is also danced around, but you can still pick up on it, even if in many ways it's not even as obvious as how Arcane presents it, which is ironic since Arcane tries to say that Piltover doesn't exploit Zaun. But for example, in the lore for the champion Renata Glass, who's a Chem Baron, her parents were killed by Piltover nobles because their research into medicine that could prolong life was a threat to them. I honestly find it funny that Arcane and League of Legends tries to not show Piltover materially exploiting Zaun, since given that Piltover is a capitalist society and the undercity is the underclass, it is natural to assume that Piltover must be exploiting Zaun given its destitute state compared to Piltover's wealth. Like, that's one of the main consequences of capitalism. The idea that capitalism can be reformed to not do this is a centrist position, not to mention wrong. And yes, I fully understand that a show can only tackle so many messages at one time, but when you base the entirety of your political commentary, or, adopting of political tension aesthetic on a class conflict, you'd think you'd at least try to discuss the economic system that is facilitating that conflict. One small way that the centrist seed was planted in Season 1 was the sidelining of Ekko as a character. Other than Sevika, although her lack of exploration was, in hindsight, also a sign, Ekko is the show's most leftist character, just like I said earlier. And while his inclusion seemed to be an indication of Arcane's leftism, the fact that he appeared as little as he did also serves as a sign to the show's centrism. There was no intention to actually explore Ekko's politics, to see him as a viable actor in the Zaun and Piltover conflict. Ekko is also only ever shown fighting fellow Zaunites, other than when he was shot by Marcus, who the show had already long written off as a horrible person who doesn't necessarily reflect Piltover or even the police force. But anyway, despite Ekko stating his conflict against Piltover, we never actually see it. This is something the show does with more than one character, like Vi, who is only ever shown fighting Zaunites as well. These are not coincidences. This is intentionally not allowing Piltover and Zaun to come into direct conflict with one another. There are even more ways in which the centrist seed was planted, but I'm saving these for the next section of the video where I do some character analysis. But just so you know, these things are Vi never exhibiting any prison or cop-related trauma throughout the entirety of Season 1, Caitlyn's arc, and then the existence and development of Caitvi as a ship. As you might know, one of the biggest complaints about Arcane Season 2 is that many of the characters were done pretty badly, whether that be they got poor treatment, poor writing, poor appearances, or all three. I think that there's a few different reasons for why Season 2 did the characters so badly, and one of those is what I'd personally call bad or at least ineffective and inconsistent writing. Another reason is that the show stopped being character-driven and started trying to get its plot from point A to point B, no matter if the decisions that required characters to make made little sense or not. And I believe that this too is a consequence of the politics that drive the show. The decisions the characters make, as well as the options that are even presented to them, are all steeped in these centrist politics. And, in theory, that is fine, if the show had been strictly centrist from the get-go. But since these characters were created with the aesthetics of leftist ideas, for some of the characters anyway, their character foundations conflict with the story the narrative wants to tell. And so that's what this section of the video is going to be discussing. I'm going to go through every main character of Arcane, as well as some of the side and supporting ones, and discuss how each of their characters was failed because of Arcane's commitment to centrism. I'll be analyzing their arcs and what they reveal about the show's politics. And I'll start with the character that in many ways is the beating heart of the show's politics. I actually have very little to say on Vander that I haven't already, but I think it's important to cover him before covering the characters of Vi and Silco, given how important his character is to getting the full picture on both of their characters. As I said before, Season 2 shows us that the intent with Vander's character was never about creating a tragic tale of a broken revolutionary, but rather he was supposed to be the one character who was right about everything, about how to fix the broken relations between Zaun and Piltover, and this is shown in a few different ways. First, there is Sevika echoing Vander's words about not giving up their own people. Then we have the entirety of Ekko's alternate timeline in Episode 7, which I'll go into detail about when I talk about Ekko. And lastly, there is the resolution of the show, where we can assume there is peace between the cities without any kind of resistance from Zaun whatsoever. To me, where the show failed Vander is that the centrist narrative made him much less of an interesting character than he could have been, at least in my opinion. Now, I'm fully aware I'm being biased here, but I don't really care. I think that the leftist interpretation of Vander as a former broken revolutionary is much more interesting than the centrist intention of him as a wise, correct man who chooses peace. It frankly makes his character more shallow, and gives the show yet another reason to never discuss how the responsibility he placed on Vi kind of fucked her up, but I digress. I'd also be remiss if I didn't at least mention Warwick. The reasons why the show underutilized and messed up with Warwick don't really have to do with its politics, at least not directly. Warwick is essentially used as a plot device to bring Vi and Jinx together, and the way in which this is done removes the sisters from being vehicles for any sort of political commentary, so there is an element of the show's politics at play here, especially when you consider the possibility that breaking people out of Stillwater, and even better, destroying it, could have easily been the way the sisters reconciled.
I grew up knowing I'm less than them. That my place is down there. I want Powder to have more than that, and I'm willing to fight for it.
Oh, Vi. Like I said at the very beginning of the video, Vi is my favorite character in the show, with Ekko following very closely behind. And as I'm sure you don't need reminding, Season 2 butchered her. And I find that what Season 2 did with Vi is probably the most clear demonstration of the show's politics. But before I can get into that, I want to start with this right here. This is from an interview with Fortiche production co-founder and Arcane co-director Pascal Charoux. Arcane has been in production for 8 years, so Fortiche has spent a long time building out unique versions of the characters and taking their stories to bold new places. In the case of Vi, it saw her original design pulled out of the male gaze and depicted as a more butch girl with a clear queer identity at the center. When exploring how Vi looks, speaks, and moves, this was one of the first things on their minds. You see that? Vi is intentionally butch. She was created and animated to be a butch lesbian, not just masculine, but butch. And this is important because butch lesbians as an identity have a rich history originating from working class lesbians. Femme also comes from this history, by the way, just putting that out there. That Arcane even featured a canon butch lesbian character as one of its main two protagonists was one of the biggest selling points of the show's progressiveness, because we never see butches featured on screen. Never. Never as main characters, for sure. However, when you watch Arcane, even with Season 1, the treatment of Vi as a character demonstrates the writer's own regressive bias towards butch lesbians and masculine women, and this treatment also shows that Vi being reimagined this way was unfortunately just another product of Arcane adopting progressive aesthetics without meaningfully engaging with them in any way. Vi was failed as a character in many ways, but there are 3 main ones that are relevant to this video. Number 1, the lack of exploration of her prison trauma. Number 2, the lack of exploration of her cop trauma. And number 3, the way in which she was completely removed from her political context. There's also a 4th, which is the entirety of Caitvi as a ship, but I'll be giving that its own section once I've finished discussing Caitlyn. Let's start with failure number 1. Vi's trauma from Stillwater is never explored. Hell, saying explored is me being generous, because truthfully it's never even acknowledged, with the exception of 2 lines in Season 1. And this is not just a Season 2 problem, this is a problem that emerged in Season 1 that was made even worse in Season 2 given the route they went down for Vi, but I'll talk more about that when I get to failure number 2. No, right now I want to talk about how Season 1 specifically failed Vi because Arcane was committed to being a centrist show. Here's what we know about Vi and Stillwater. Marcus threw her there the night that her entire family died right before her eyes, and she saw her sister being approached by the guy who was responsible holding a knife, right after she was told by her dying father to take care of her sister. We know that Marcus put her there without any records of who she is or what her crimes were, meaning that she was likely to stay there indefinitely. We know that she was there for 7 years. We know that she was regularly beaten by at least a warden, but it is very easy to assume other guards were involved. Beaten with a baton the size of Caitlyn's entire body, mind you. We know that she regularly fought with other prisoners. We know that she was regularly kept in a solitary cell many, many levels below ground. We know that when she's in her cell, Vi self-harms, punching the stone walls. Yes, this is self-harm. I'm not going to entertain any argument saying otherwise. Oh, and if we take the Warden's Big Mama comment to Sevika in Season 2, we can very easily assume a frequency of, at the very least, sexual harassment by at least the Warden. Whether Vi experienced that, we don't know, but it's a possibility. These are all things the show directly shows or tells us, and if we want to use the Stillwater files, which were part of a promotional minigame when the first season of Arcane released, then we know that Vi's injuries were left untreated, and that she'd been attacked with knives, spiked knuckles, and a sock with nails in it. Now, I don't know about y'all, but all of this sounds fucking horrible. Prisons are fucking horrible. Stillwater seems to be one of the most inhumane prisons I've ever seen depicted on screen. But do you know what's very interesting about all of these awful things Vi was forced to endure? We see absolutely zero indication or evidence of it affecting her in any way, other than those 2 lines, which say very little, to be honest. Vi never mentions anything in the way of having trauma from Stillwater. Given that Season 1 did a great job of exploring Jinx's trauma, I have to wonder why this is. Surely, if they did Jinx justice, they could have done Vi justice as well. How did it serve the show to never talk about Vi's prison trauma, you may ask? I think the answer is simple. If Arcane actually contended with Vi's experience in prison, there is no way in hell they could have the centrist narrative that they did. Exploring Vi's prison trauma would necessarily require that they go more in-depth on the topic of police violence and incarceration than they wanted to. That's why the show never actually takes the time to discuss the sheer injustice that is Marcus throwing a 15-year-old Vi into Stillwater with no process, no trial, etc., because making that commentary was never the show's intent. So then, why put Vi in prison at all? Now we're asking the right question, and I'd argue that there are 2 answers to this one. One of them I'll save for when I discuss Caitvi. The other is that the writers simply did not fucking care. Check out this excerpt from the art book. Vi was in prison for years, so we had to design a prison, and that was tricky because Piltover is supposed to be a city of progress. Do they really put people in prison? Maybe only people from the undercity, and maybe they put them really far away, a bit like Alcatraz. We worked on the design of that prison, and at some point we were like, no, we have to embrace that it's not a progressive prison. Well then. Those are certainly words that were published in the art book. Ignoring the other bullshit that is whatever the hell a progressive prison is, that last part of the quote implies that they were going to make Stillwater a less brutal place, but then upped the inhumanity. But why? They didn't need to make Stillwater so utterly inhumane, especially since the show never bothers to embrace Vi's trauma from Stillwater anyway. To me, this proves that Vi being put in prison was never meant to be an opportunity for political commentary. Well, the fact that it was never used for that was proof enough, but this is further proof. No, Vi was put in prison because they needed her somewhere for 7 years. And perhaps this is me being uncharitable, I'm honestly convinced that those behind this decision thought of prison as an aesthetic. They thought it was an element that would make Vi cooler, you know, the badass guy who was in prison type of thing. Because again, if you're not using prison for political commentary, what the hell are you using it for? An aesthetic, that's what. For these creators, prison is an aesthetic. That's why we see Vi go in as a scrawny kid and come out as a muscled adult with cool-ass tattoos all over her body. I fully acknowledge that I'm now being uncharitable, but I just have to wonder if the creatives ever considered the conditions Vi would have to get those tattoos in, unsanitary, using unregulated tools. For God's sakes, there is a real possibility that the entire thing was a stick and poke. The Stillwater files claim that Vi's tattoos were all self-inked, which anyone with common sense can deduce is bullshit in about 2 seconds, so no, I don't believe anyone thought of Vi's backstory in creating her character design other than the representations of her family in her tattoos. I think Vi's prison experience just being window dressing, a backdrop for her character, is obvious when you think of the ways that she's not affected by it. Vi never experiences any symptoms of PTSD from prison. She doesn't flinch when she's touched, she doesn't shy from loud noises, she's fine being around enforcers, more on this in a little bit, etc. Frankly, given that Vi spent a lot of time in solitary confinement, something that we know is detrimental to mental health, Vi should have a lot more mental struggles than what we see. And Vi does have mental struggles in the show, but they are not related to her time in prison in any way. That is absurd. And no one ever acknowledges the injustice that was done onto her either, which is another reason why Vi not having anything to do with the Stillwater breakout in Season 2, Episode 4, not even being mentioned, is just so ridiculous. Vi also appears to be in pretty great physical condition other than being a bit on the skinny side. That is extremely unrealistic. Need I remind you that Vi regularly punched stone walls? At the very least, Vi should have chronic pain in her hands from all the micro breaks she must have introduced into her bones. In another show, I might not feel the need to point this out, but Arcane is a show that includes characters with many kinds of disabilities. Viktor, Jinx, Sevika, Silco, Jayce, and Caitlyn all either start or end the show disabled. But Vi does not, and I believe this ties into what I said earlier about the treatment of Vi's character being a symptom of the writer's regressive attitudes towards masculine women, and butch lesbians specifically. I am entirely convinced that the show never delved into Vi's mental or physical trauma because the creators behind it think that Vi is too strong to demonstrate that kind of weakness. This is obviously a horrible way to think, but I see no reason to believe that the people behind this show didn't think that. Now, I can already hear people asking, but what about the pit fighter montage? And to that I have to say, sorry, but the pit fighter montage was a very unserious thing. Not only was half the montage a thirst trap, but the show acted as if the only trauma Vi had was her breakup with Caitlyn. Vi's alcoholism is treated with no sincerity or even realism, since she just stops drinking cold turkey without any clear evidence of withdrawal. So no, the show has never taken Vi's trauma seriously. This leads me right into failure number 2, which is that Arcane does not ever acknowledge or explore the trauma Vi should have from enforcers. My arguments here are similar to what I argued about Vi never exhibiting any trauma from prison. The show begins with Vi and Jinx seeing their dead parents on the bridge, killed by enforcers. Jinx may have been too young to fully understand what happened, but Vi clearly knew. That right there is already more than enough reason for Vi to have enforcer-related trauma. And even if you want to assume that the enforcers did no other violent actions in Zaun between that day and after Vi and Ko's heist, all you have to do is remember the fact that Vi was in prison for 7 years, where the people who worked there were enforcers. The people who beat Vi regularly were enforcers. Vi should be seeing blue and gold in her fucking nightmares. But again, the show could not explore this, because if they did, then their centrist plot could not happen. Notice how Vi's only objection to becoming an enforcer in Season 2, Episode 1 is that they killed her parents, not that they've been violently oppressing Zaun, or even that they flat-out tortured her in prison. If the show treated Vi's experience with any of the gravity it deserved, Vi would never have become an enforcer. That is why her choosing to do so in Episode 1 of Season 2 is laughably out of character, the beginning of an entire season of Vi being out of character. Because I'll be talking about Caitvi as a ship separately, I'm going to put a pin in this discussion of Vi and enforcers, because there's more to say, but it all has to do with that ship. Which means now I can talk about failure number 3. Arcane, by the end, removes Vi from her political context. I mean a few different things when I say this. One of the things I'm referring to is the way that everything Vi does in Season 2 does not make sense with the experience that she's had, so again, this is about the way the show ignores her prison and enforcer trauma. The other thing I'm referring to is that by the end of the show, Vi is completely severed from all ties that she had to Zaun, since of course the show forgets that Ekko exists. And this is supposed to be good for her. This is supposed to be her choosing happiness for herself, except for the part where she had no choice in any of this. I'm getting mad, but this is besides the point of discussing the centrism of Arcane, and so I'll move on. A lot of what I could say will also be addressed in the Caitvi section of this video anyway. The last thing I want to talk about with Vi is that although the ball was dropped on her character in Season 2, I don't believe she was ever going to have an ending that I was entirely pleased with. Knowing that Vi is a cop in League of Legends, knowing that the show always intended for Vander to be right, and seeing what this shitty Season 2 did with her character, I personally believe that Vi's character arc was always supposed to end with her embracing Vander's centrist/liberal teachings, becoming a bridge between Piltover and Zaun, which realistically would mean her becoming an enforcer, or at the very least working with them in some capacity. Season 2 completely failed to achieve even this because they decided to remove Vi from any attempts at political commentary for whatever reason, but I believe that this is what was intended with her character. And even this idea fails Vi, because even this idea still fails to understand that with the character they created in Vi, she more than any other person in the show would absolutely hate Piltover and everything it stands for. Unfortunately, in a centrist show like Arcane, a character such as Vi would always be failed. The worst part about the way Arcane treated Caitlyn's character in Season 2 is that they never committed to anything with her, never carried out anything to their logical conclusion. Her corruption arc starts great, but then it's abandoned. Then she never actually does anything to earn redemption for the things she did during the rest of Season 2. And in the midst of all this, there are multiple things that Caitlyn does that I personally find to be irredeemable, or at the very least, reasons why Caitvi should not have been endgame, but the show doesn't commit to having Caitlyn deal with the consequences of her actions either. So in the end, her arc is incredibly unsatisfying and insulting, and it is all because the show wanted to be centrist while still trying to play up to some leftist aesthetics. In the aftermath of Season 1, Caitlyn is grief-stricken because of the loss of her mother. In Episode 1, she still largely resembles the woman we knew from Season 1, except with some of the inklings of her corruption arc already starting to show themselves, such as with the prejudice she so easily shows towards Zaunites. Episode 2 is when it all starts falling apart, because we now see Caitlyn use gas weapons against Zaunites. Mind you, this is still the beginning of her corruption arc. Gas weapons are somehow not the culmination. This is because the show does not portray police violence with any sincerity whatsoever. For fuck's sake, the episode begins with a comic book style montage of police violence. Personally, the use of gas weapons is morally repugnant, and so by episode 2 I flat out dislike Caitlyn and find her irredeemable. I know by this metric I should also find Vi irredeemable, but I find her characterization to be utterly laughable in Season 2 that I can't even take this seriously for her. For Caitlyn, though, this could have been in character with better writing and more time spent on her making this decision. Episode 3 is actually a good entry for Caitlyn's corruption arc. Her harrowing determination to shoot Jinx despite a child being in the way, her shooting Vi in the gauntlet. It's when the show decides to have her hit Vi, which I'll talk more about later, that I get very, very concerned about what the hell they're going to be showing me this season. And after that is when we get the admittedly pretty great scene of Caitlyn being promoted to Commander. The first 3 episodes are actually by and large pretty good for Caitlyn, other than the use of gas weapons, which was a mistake, because the centrism of the show hasn't quite ruined her character yet. Because in the first 3 episodes, it is very easy to interpret Caitlyn's character as symbolizing the conditional activist, the privileged person seemingly dedicated to equality who balks at the first sign of the violence that the oppressed experienced on the daily. However, what's funny about interpreting Caitlyn's character like this is that, given that Arcane itself is liberal and centrist, the show would never have been able to fully realize the commentary it made here, not without criticizing itself and its writers. This is one of the many reasons why Caitlyn receives no consequences in Season 2, but I'll talk about that shortly. It is in Act 2 that Caitlyn's arc falls apart. We see that Caitlyn has been keeping up martial law for months, but of course we barely get to see the violence of that because martial law is just a backdrop, not something the show wants to offer any commentary on whatsoever. Nope. Instead, we get yet another distasteful music video full of police violence that serves to distance Caitlyn from the violence she's enacting onto the Zaunites, a desperate attempt not to portray Caitlyn as irredeemable as she truly is in Season 2. In Episode 4, we also learn that Caitlyn has been sending Zaunites to Stillwater. You know, the horrible, inhumane prison that she found Vi in. And, despite Caitlyn at least banning the use of the cells Vi was housed in, but then threatening Singed with them, meaning this is pointless, we find out that she's kept the warden who frequently beat Vi employed at the prison. Why the actual fuck would she do this? I'll tell you why. It's because the show does not give 2 shits about Vi's prison trauma, as I've already established. Again, if the show did actually treat that topic with any sincerity, it would reveal the irredeemability of both Piltover and Caitlyn very quickly, and Arcane could not have that. Also, the entire idea that Stillwater as a prison can be reformed in any way is just gross. But again, I'm not surprised by this show. Centrism loves throwing around that reform word. The rest of Caitlyn's arc passes with very little fanfare, from her reunion with Vi, more on that later, to her betraying Mbessa, to all the other bullshit that happens in episodes 8 and 9. The most important thing to know is that Caitlyn receives no consequences for anything she did in Season 2. Vi weakly calls her out in episode 8, but it's framed as Caitlyn is in the wrong for letting herself get manipulated by Mbessa. This too is bullshit. In order to protect Caitlyn from the consequences of her actions, Arcane attempts to make a scapegoat out of Ambessa, but this doesn't work for multiple reasons. One of them is that her instigating of the memorial service attack goes absolutely nowhere. As the audience, we're meant to use the fact that she instigated it as the reason to blame her instead of Caitlyn for going full war criminal mode and using gas weapons. That's bullshit because Caitlyn chose to do that. No one told her she needed to use the gray, she decided that on her own. The second reason why making a scapegoat out of Ambessa doesn't work is because Caitlyn is a grown woman making her own choices, despite how much the show tries to coddle her. Outside of the scene where Caitlyn is promoted to commander, we only see Ambessa manipulate Caitlyn one time, and frankly, you can hardly call this manipulation. After Rictus causes a violent scene down in Zaun, Caitlyn is upset, and she says why is peace always the justification for violence? Ambessa then manages to talk her back into seeing violence as the way, I guess, but the scene truly just shows Caitlyn's lack of a moral spine. Also, we're meant to view this scene as Caitlyn's good heart peeking through or whatever, but in the end, Caitlyn is still in charge, so if she's actually upset with the way Ambessa's forces are conducting themselves, she can put a stop to it. She chooses not to. She chooses to allow the raid on the Zaunite rally that leads to the arrests of dozens, including a 7-year-old. The show is trying to pull its old tricks of, oh, she doesn't know, but that doesn't work when the person who doesn't know is the literal commander of martial law. Caitlyn, by definition, would know what the hell is going on, so this liberal, oh, she's just being ignorant nonsense doesn't work. Not that it ever does, but it doubly does not work here, especially when in Season 1, Caitlyn already got her shedding my ignorance arc. In episode 8, we get another insulting scene between Caitlyn and Jinx, where Caitlyn says a whole lot of nothing of value, showing about 2 lines of regret for her literal war crimes, and the show tries to act like the violence Caitlyn has done against not even just Jinx, but Zaun itself, is equivalent to what Jinx did to the Council. Once again, that is centrist bullshit, since the violence of the oppressed and the violence of the oppressor are not at all equivalent. The show refuses to contend with the power that Caitlyn has over Jinx. Jinx is literally imprisoned in this conversation, and over Vi, but I'll detail that second point when I talk about Caitvi. In the end, Caitlyn's arc fails because Arcane tries to imbue it with aesthetics, just like they imbued Season 1 with the aesthetics of police violence. Caitlyn's actions are never treated seriously, and so her arc is an unsatisfying mess of centrist politics. You can't just come back from occupying a place for months because you feel bad. That's not how that fucking works. Caitlyn does absolutely nothing to earn her redemption. We hear nothing about how she's helping to rebuild Zaun, provide reparations, etc. at the end of the show. It's very possible that she still even gets to be in charge of the police in Piltover. She has lost nothing. I refuse to entertain the argument that Caitlyn losing her eye is part of her redemption, because it's not. Losing an eye has absolutely nothing to do with Caitlyn redeeming herself. She didn't fight Ambessa out of any sense of sacrifice. She was just trying to survive. And even if the fight was supposed to be a sacrifice, what help would Caitlyn dying to Ambessa do for anyone? Exactly, nothing. It was pointless. In hindsight, I think there was always a liberal flair to Caitlyn's character. I mean, privileged person becoming an ally because of shedding their naivety and learning more about the true state of the world, that's normally a very liberal narrative. However, there was still the potential for it to be leftist had Caitlyn undergone the next steps by then joining Zaun in its revolutionary struggle. Hell, there was even potential for Caitlyn's character to still fit leftist political commentary even with her corruption arc. However, that would have required the show to commit to the arc, and commit to Caitvi not being endgame, and Arcane was not prepared to do either of those things. Speaking of Caitvi, let me talk about them now. Caitvi was always a vehicle for the show's centrism, and I'm saying this as someone who thought they were cute, or at least had potential, in Season 1. If the show had gone through with making Caitlyn into a revolutionary, Caitvi would have ate down. Hell, if they had actually intentionally made Vi's story a tragedy, I could have been okay with it in a different way. But anyway, yes, even in Season 1, Caitvi was a demonstration of the show's centrism, and let me tell you why. Firstly, the fact is that Caitvi and its development in Season 1 does not make a terrible amount of sense when you really consider it. As I just got through explaining a little bit ago, Vi should have severe enforcer trauma. Her experiences with Caitlyn for that reason alone should not have been positive. At the very least, she has absolutely no reason to trust Caitlyn as much as she does in such a short period of time. And things really stop making sense in episode 7 when she pushes Ekko away from Caitlyn far too harshly, and when she runs to Caitlyn without any concern for Ekko, who just got shot. Already, this sowed the seeds of Vi's relationships in Zaun, her sense of community among the oppressed, being sidelined in favor of Caitvi. And while I have heard some defenses here saying that Vi focuses more on people rather than systems or categories, which is why she's able to trust and fall for Caitlyn so fast despite her being a rich enforcer, that fails to hold up when you consider all the quips Vi throws Caitlyn's way about enforcers being asshole criminals or topsiders always screwing over Zaunites. And in the end, this both-sidesism is still centrist, so my overall point stands even if you find Vi's behavior realistic or in character. Now, at the time, it was easy to brush all of this aside in favor of appreciating the cute little lesbian romance we had, and I was fully prepared to do just that if the show delivered on them in Season 2. But since the show didn't do that shit in any kind of way, I'm now going back to the criticisms I had of Caitvi in Season 1. Because listen, I don't care how cute it is, there's absolutely no healthy reason why Vi should have fallen in love with Caitlyn. The only thing that makes sense, given that otherwise Vi should not be comfortable around Caitlyn at all, is that Vi is latching on to the first person to show her kindness in 7 years, and that is not healthy in any way. But considering that Season 2 of the show seems to enjoy the dynamic between Caitlyn and Vi being unhealthy, not toxic though, because God forbid Vi fights back, I have to wonder if this was done on purpose. Though that would require the writing team to actually give a shit about Vi's mental state, so I don't think it was done on purpose. No, the actual reason that Vi does not show any discomfort around Caitlyn outside of a couple lines of lip service is that if Vi showed any enforcer trauma, and if any of that was projected onto Caitlyn, then that would conflict with the show's centrist narrative that enforcers as a systematic whole aren't a problem. It's just bad apples like Marcus who are the problem, and good cops like Caitlyn can change the system. You know, reformist bullshit. That is why, even in Season 1, Caitvi is propaganda. Because, see, if Vi, someone with bad experiences with enforcers, can be in love with an enforcer, that shows that enforcers aren't bad people. Season 2 takes all the problems of Season 1 Caitvi, doesn't address them, makes them worse, and then actively makes new problems for the relationship. In other words, Season 2 Caitvi is hot fucking garbage, because the show is centrist, and the writers have a clear fetish for oppressor x oppressed. That sounds like a joke, but I'm afraid I'm being serious. There is something seriously wrong with these people. Oh, and also I'm convinced they hate butch lesbians. The number one problem for Caitvi as a ship in Season 2 is that the power imbalance between Caitlyn and Vi is never addressed. And I mean never. I can't even tell how much the writers realized the power imbalance was there. If Caitlyn hadn't let Vi live at her home after Season 1, where would Vi have lived? If the show gave a shit about their relationship, with Ekko and the Firelights, but since the show does not care about them, we can safely assume Vi would have been homeless. Does the show even realize this? I don't think so, because it never brings it up. When Caitlyn leaves Vi in Episode 3, she leaves Vi homeless with only the clothes on her back, clothes that would likely get her jumped walking around Zaun. That's why she had to dye her hair and wear heavy makeup. But again, the show does not present us with this information at all, we have to deduce this ourselves. The power difference in Caitvi makes me even more uncomfortable when thinking about Vi becoming an enforcer. While I don't think it would be Vi's character to feel pressured in this way, it's still very much in the realm of possibility that Vi felt like she had to say yes to Caitlyn in the end so that she wouldn't be fucking kicked out onto the streets. Again, I don't think the show ever considered the implications of any of this, but these are not very large stretches of the imagination that I'm making here. Literally, Caitlyn could have thrown Vi back into Stillwater at any time throughout Act 1. That is never acknowledged or addressed. By the end of the show, Caitlyn and Vi have the exact same power difference as they started with, and I find that to be very uncomfortable and disturbing. And the reason they still have this power difference is because the show was never prepared to address it. After all, centrists don't mind social hierarchy. For God's sake, Vi's internalized belief that she's less than topsiders is never actually dealt with, and in fact, her final line of the show compares herself to dirt underneath her oppressor's nails. I need these writers blacklisted, or at least fired, or I will at least not watch anything that they write again. Please go find something else to do with your life, because writing is not it. I want to talk about some individual moments in Season 2 that really showcase how centrism poisoned this ship from the inside out. First is the scene in Episode 1 where Caitlyn offers Vi the badge. This scene is played entirely as an interpersonal conflict, not the political request of the oppressor to the oppressed to join her oppressors in their oppression. Say that 3 times fast. But seriously, I just think again of Nikki's thread. The way Vi is written in this scene, the enforcers are just the scumbags that killed her parents, not the oppressive system that regularly enacts violence onto her people. Hell, they're not even the fucking scumbags that frankly tortured her in prison. We don't even get that. Instead, we get Caitlyn's horribly insensitive request, as well as her horribly insensitive comment about knowing how it feels to have her parents killed the way Vi's were, and this comment is never called out. That's a theme for Season 2 Caitvi. Caitlyn never getting called out for her shit, since, similar to what I said when talking about her character individually, the show can't afford to call her out since that would call attention to the politics they're trying to avoid commenting on. The next scene is the scene that turned me off of Caitvi for good, and that is the scene where Caitlyn hits Vi. This scene is disgusting, and my head is spinning trying to organize all my thoughts to talk about why. I mean, first off, it's literally domestic violence. That is made even worse considering in the real world, cops have higher incidence rates of domestic violence. And somehow, it still gets worse because Caitlyn uses a cop tactic, butting Vi with a rifle, to strike her. She strikes the person with enforcer trauma, or the person who should have it anyway, using an enforcer tactic. And if you guys somehow thought it couldn't get worse, remember that Caitlyn chose to do this. This was not an instinctual action. Caitlyn waited for seconds and she decided to hit Vi. This was a calculated action. And the show never brings it up again. I personally don't see that moment in the sex scene as bringing it up, just telling you now. So anyway, yeah, the show never addresses this disgusting action again. That is because, again, about half the stuff I brought up here, these writers would not even think about. Not Vi's enforcer trauma, not real-world cop DV, not Caitlyn using an enforcer tactic. If the show did think about any of these things, especially the parallel to real-world cop DV, the scene would have had political commentary, but it does not. This is just interpersonal violence bathed in the aesthetic of police violence. The other reason why I believe the show went this direction and never brought it up again is because, sadly, these writers very clearly have an issue with butch phobia. Caitlyn, a feminine lesbian, hitting Vi, a masculine lesbian, is not as big a deal to them as it should be. And I know this because after this batch of episodes premiered, people on Twitter tried to downplay the hit too, saying that somehow a rifle hit to the abdomen wouldn't hurt. There were also many others making rather disgusting jokes about butch lesbians like Vi experiencing domestic violence. And be prepared to see a lot more abhorrent tweets like this near the end of the video. The next time Caitlyn and Vi see each other, Caitlyn hits Vi 2 more times. I am thoroughly convinced that these people have a kink for seeing Vi get hit by the people she loves, considering Jinx does it to her later. I hate this scene as well, but I have very little I can say about it other than yet again Caitlyn doesn't face any consequences for her behavior, since Vi is able to banter with her just fine despite everything Caitlyn did to her in her city. Which reminds me that Vi was never shown reacting to or dealing with the martial law in any way, so that's great. Moving on, we have the confrontation between Vi and Caitlyn in episode 8. This scene once again sucks, because Caitlyn still doesn't face any consequences for her behavior. Vi is angry with her at least, but that doesn't last very long, and the argument between them ends with Caitlyn throwing a boat, meaning she still resorts to physicality when she doesn't win an argument. Isn't that just a great thing to show us? Yeah, I'm being petty. I didn't need to include this scene, but I think more people need to recognize how fucked up this scene is when we've already seen Caitlyn hit Vi and never even fucking apologize for it. The next scene that demonstrates the absolute garbage writing for Caitvi in Season 2 is the prison cell sex scene. I need everyone involved with this blacklisted from the industry yesterday, and I'm not fucking playing. This scene is fucking disgusting. Not only does it start with the liberal out-of-character bullshit of Vi being mad that Jinx didn't want to join the fight, but it is yet another scene that minimizes and dismisses Vi's prison trauma. When Vi is clearly in the midst of a mental breakdown, Caitlyn flirts with her because that's hot, I guess? And then they have sex. And the only thing that Caitlyn apologizes for, since this also doubles as their reconciliation, is getting together with Maddie. Not hitting Vi, not for all the vile things she said to her, not for the fucking martial law, not for anything actually important, but for fucking an irrelevant side character. Once again, Caitlyn receives no consequences for her behavior, and instead she gets to be eaten out by Vi in a prison cell because these writers love to put Vi underneath Caitlyn in every circumstance. And before anyone even starts, no, being a top is not fucking degrading or whatever the hell kind of words you want to put in my mouth. I'm honestly glad that they made Vi a stone top because it feeds my asexual Vi headcanon. All I'm saying is they decided to choreograph the sex scene in such a way where Vi gets on her knees for Caitlyn while they're fucking in a jail cell. I mean, come on now. This scene spits in the face of any kind of leftist political commentary because of the way it completely dismisses and undermines Vi's prison trauma. Vi literally broke open the skin on her hands from punching the wall minutes earlier, a self-harming behavior she engaged in while in prison. But this is just window dressing for the sex scene. It's not treated with any seriousness whatsoever. For fuck's sake, in the leaked storyboards for the sex scene, punch marks are in the wall. If Arcane was committed to making a political commentary on the inhumanity of prisons, or anything remotely like that, this scene would not have happened. But no, this scene is just the ultimate proof that Vi's time in prison is just window dressing, just backdrop. It's the ultimate proof of what Amanda Overton, a lead writer on the show, admitted to in an interview with Gizmodo. The Enforcer conflict, one of the biggest reasons why we thought this show was going to be leftist, was only invented for Caitvi. Oh. Do you think I'm joking? I wish I was. Please, read this with me. For me, it was just a huge responsibility to tell an epic series-long romance. We were going to make them endgame, so we had to make, for me, the most satisfying things are the journeys that are the most difficult to come by. I was like, well, we've got to make this as hard as possible. If Caitlyn's an enforcer, what if enforcers killed Vi's parents? That was something we invented in the first week of the room so they would have the hardest possible journey to come together. Well then, that puts things into perspective, doesn't it? That's not the only thing Miss Overton has said that is fucking disgusting either, because she also spoke about this scene, and I'll let y'all listen to that.
But for me personally, it was a moment to be like, oh, we can actually kind of reclaim this trauma for Vi. We can help her heal in a lot of ways, which I think that was for us something that Vi's arc really did for her. Like I've mentioned that we wanted Vi to be able to ask who she was if she had no one left to protect. And that meant Vi saying, what does Vi want? Instead of what does Vi do for other people? And sort of one way to do that was for me was getting to sort of process that trauma and reclaim it for herself and work through it and now be able to move forward from it in a healthier, happy way.
These are the people writing Arcane. These are the politics of the people writing Arcane. Prison trauma can be healed by having sex in a prison cell. That's the politics of these people. I have no words. So, I guess I'll just move on to the last scene, which is actually just the ending of this show. As you might have guessed, I utterly abhor, hate, and loathe this ending. Like I said before, the power difference between Caitlyn and Vi is still there. If Caitlyn gets mad one day, she can kick Vi out onto the street. We have no assurance that Caitlyn will never hit Vi again. For fuck's sake, Caitlyn never unlearned her prejudice against Zaunites. And this is supposed to be Vi's good ending. They don't care that Vi is in a city that will never respect her, in a house with a man that is prejudiced against her, with someone who hasn't even unlearned her own bias. They don't care that Vi is completely isolated from her community. They don't care that Vi has lost her entire purpose in life, her family, which, again, that's apart from Ekko, but the show found it more convenient to abandon their relationship. They don't care that Vi is completely dependent on Caitlyn. Maybe they even like it. They like that Vi is in this unhealthy dynamic with horrible implications. They like that Vi is in the goddamn sunken place. And all of this is because the show wanted to stick to its centrist politics, by never addressing the power difference between Caitvi, by never addressing Vi's prison or enforcer trauma, by never giving Caitlyn any consequences for her behavior, and by cutting Vi off from Zaun because they do not care about community. Arcane has given us this utterly abysmal ending for Caitvi, and for Vi specifically as a character. Great job, everyone! Lesbian representation. Let's talk about Ekko. I've already said pretty much all that needs to be said about him when it comes to Season 1. He's one of the show's most leftist characters, but he was sidelined because giving him too much focus would detract from the show's centrist message. That's why a lot of Ekko fans, myself included, are actually somewhat glad he didn't appear too much in Season 2, or else they probably would have ruined his character like they did with so many others. What's funny is that Season 2 did very well try. In fact, this insidious centrist seed was planted back in Season 1. What am I talking about? One word. Heimerdinger. With the Ekko that we had been presented with, there is very little reason for him to be so friendly with Heimerdinger. You know, the guy who is one of the key people responsible for Piltover's oppression and neglect of Zaun. For Ekko to never even call Heimerdinger out on his shit is liberal bullshit. Full stop. It's easy to dismiss this as Ekko just being practical. He needed Heimerdinger's help to get back to the Firelight's base in Season 1, and in Season 2 he needed his help figuring out what is going on with his tree. And I'd be happy to make these dismissals. Except, again, the show is asking us to make interpretations it does not make any real indications towards. And this interpretation still doesn't answer the question of why Ekko showed Heimerdinger the Firelight's base and allowed him to live there. Again, maybe you could say that Ekko wants to keep an eye on Heimerdinger so he can't give away the base's location, but yet again, we get no indication of this or even of an internal conflict for Ekko. Oh, and fun fact about the first scene of Ekko in Season 2, where he and the Firelights are dealing with an influx of people, an influx that is said to be because of all the Chem Barons fighting upon Silco's death. Yeah, so when the first few episodes of Season 2, their unfinished versions, leaked the August before the premiere, originally people were coughing when entering the Firelight's base. Coughing. I wonder why that could be. Oh, I know, how about the gas weaponry currently being utilized in Zaun's streets? The fact that the show removed the evidence that the Grey would be affecting more than just the targeted Chem Barons is very, very telling of its politics and how it feels about gas weaponry and police violence. This is purposefully trying to make Piltover's actions look less bad, as well as make Zaun's actions look worse. The tweet informing me about this is linked if you want to compare the scenes for yourself, but I didn't want to put leaked audio in this video. In Season 2, Ekko at least gets to call Jayce out on building the equivalent of a bomb underground, so if it ever goes off, it would explode Zaun and not Piltover, but like with Vi's lines in Season 1, this is just lip service since there's never any follow-up or consequences for this. And then, of course, Ekko is absent for the entirety of Act 2, which, given that he is one of the most leftist characters of the show, is not an accident. In Episode 7, it is revealed that he and Heimerdinger are stuck in an alternate timeline where things seem to be going really great between Zaun and Piltover. Zaun isn't polluted, there's market stalls on the bridge, Vander and Silco have reconciled, no one's fighting to the death, and everyone's alive and happy. Except for Vi, because Arcane hates her. That sounds like a joke, but it's really not. This is the part of the video where I'm going to talk about everything wrong with the alternate timeline. Very little of this actually has to do with Ekko, so I'm sorry to have put it in this section of the video, but it was the best place to put it. I'll tie everything back to him after I'm done anyway. Okay, so full stop, the alternate timeline is neoliberal bullshit that completely falls apart when you put any critical thought into it. What the timeline tries to imply is that Hextech, because at this point the show has fully abandoned the Piltover vs. Zaun plotline and is only focusing on the Arcane, and to a lesser extent Vander and Silco's fallout, is why things are so bad between Zaun and Piltover. Both of those things are bullshit. Let's start with the Hextech. It seems that Arcane Season 2 had forgotten why Vi and Co. even robbed Jayce's apartment in the first place. Last I checked, which was literally earlier in this video, they did it because they needed the cash they could get from pawning off his items, because they have very little in the way of resources. The big thing to note here is that the problems between Piltover and Zaun already exist. Did the show forget that around 4 years before this, a group of Zaunites were massacred on the bridge by enforcers? These problems already exist. The whole point with Hextech is that it exacerbated inequalities that were already there. It did not create them, but Season 2, Episode 7 seems to believe differently. This is another example of Arcane attempting to distance Piltover from its oppression of Zaun, something it has to do if it wants its centrist narrative to make any kind of sense. That is also why the show presents Vander's and Silco's reconciliation as one of the driving forces for this good timeline. Even ignoring what many have already said about how there is very little chance these two could reconcile by Act 1 of Season 1, especially with Vander's shitty apology letter, that the reconciliation between two former Zaunite revolutionaries, a reconciliation that more than likely ends with Silco changing a lot more than Vander, is apparently one of the things needed for this happy ending, clearly implies that many of Zaun's problems are caused by itself. It subtly, or unsubtly, serves to put the blame on Silco, yet again, for things that are in one way or another Piltover's fault. And then lastly, there's the idea that Vi's death would mean anything in the first place. I can buy that Vi dying as a result of Jayce's experiments would stop Hextech from being developed, whether Jayce fully goes through with killing himself or Mel never takes the risk to invest. That part is fine. No, I'm talking about the implication that her death is what sparks talks of peace between the cities, because obviously there had to be some other changes beyond no hex tech that got Piltover and Zaun to where they are in the alternate timeline. Maybe we're meant to assume that the effort that would have gone into Piltover's investment in hex tech is instead put towards investing in their undercity, but there would still have to be something that sparked that, and I believe that we're meant to assume that Vi's death is what did that. That is bullshit. Based on what we have already seen in the show, such as, the scene where Vi and Jayce storm the Shimmer factory that ends with a dead child, we already know that seeing a dead Zaunite child doesn't do jack shit for getting Piltovians to get off their ass and care about the Undercity. Now, to Arcane's credit, this event is what gets Jayce to consider making peace with Silco, but you have to remember that while independence for Zaun is good, independence under Silco would not materially help the Undercity, something that Jayce is already aware of. So Jayce, and in the rest of the Council, accepting this peace agreement has nothing to do with helping the Undercity, it's about wiping their hands of their Undercity problem, of their responsibility towards Zaun. But again, the show doesn't care about any of this. Arcane wants us to believe that this abstract idea of peace is the end goal, the best resolution to a conflict like the one between Piltover and Zaun, and that's liberal bullshit. Alright, I promise I'd bring Ekko back into this, and I don't break my promises. I believe that putting Ekko in this alternate timeline is how Season 2 failed him because of its commitment to centrism. There's already the very obvious reason that Ekko was sidelined in Season 2, but the other reason why putting Ekko in this alternate timeline failed him is because of what the plot does for his character. The point of Ekko being in this timeline has nothing to do with what he learns about the situation between Piltover and Zaun, nothing to do with him figuring out different ways to fight for his people, nothing to do with any part of the leftist politics of his character. No, the point of him being in this timeline is for Time Bomb and Time Bomb only. It's about him understanding that Jinx and Powder are the same person and that he can't give up on Jinx. And that's cute and all, but that reduces Ekko's arc to that of his relationship. Wow, like brother like sister, am I right? Okay, but seriously, Ekko's entire leftist politic is abandoned in and after this episode. It was subtle, but he too became victim to the show's centrism, given that he also came to Piltover's aid with no actual shown reason to do so. And, just like his sister Vi, because the show has reduced his character to just his romantic relationship, he gets a fucking horrible ending where he loses the girl he loves despite saving everybody. We don't even see him reunite with his people or anything. Through Ekko, the collectivity of Zaunites is forgotten about, and some of the final vestiges of leftism in the show wither and die. It may come as a surprise that I actually don't have a lot to say about Jinx. From the beginning, Jinx was not exactly one of the political vehicles of the show. In Act 1 of Season 1, anything I can say about politics with her I already said when I've talked about Vi. In Act 2, there is very little to discuss as well. It's only in Act 3 that we get some political substance with her. For one thing, she kills enforcers indiscriminately, which is the only time we see any character attack enforcers in the show, and it is treated like a massacre. Given that Jinx in Season 1 is an antagonist, this too, in hindsight, is pretty telling of the show's centrist politics, demonizing the killing of anyone despite the fact that the police are a force of violence. And then there is of course the very ending of Season 1, which is Jinx attacking the council. Thinking of this scene now, I go back to Nikki's thread, where she talked about how this act was merely a reflection of the failed reconciliation between the sisters, and the way the show framed this was always weird to me, because even when I watched Season 1, it did not feel like the act of violent resistance that it objectively is, but rather just Jinx lashing out. Even if it is Jinx lashing out, it's still political, don't get it twisted. The only reason why Jinx can stand there and shoot the council building is because of the generations of violence Piltover has enacted against Zaun. But in that scene, in the Tea Party, that was not the focus in any way. Given that in Season 2 we never actually see anyone but Piltovians discuss the aftermath of Jinx's attack on the council, we're only presented with perspectives that villainize it and remove it from its inherently political nature. It's simply seen as a random act of violence. The sidelining of Ekko and Sevika are particularly loud in this case. The show wants us to believe the attack was something bad, the breaking of a peace that didn't even exist. No wonder it took place right as the council was going to grant Zaun's independence. Too bad that awful terrorist ruined everything, right? This is the demonizing of revolutionary action in real time. It doesn't matter that the council was about to grant Zaun independence. First off, I already talked about how that's not even a good move from them. And secondly, how would anyone even know they were doing that? How did anyone even know they were meeting that night? Jinx didn't even know Caitlyn's mom was in there, meaning she either didn't know Caitlyn was Cassandra's daughter, unlikely given that she kidnapped Caitlyn from the Kierman mansion, or she did not know the council was meeting that night, meaning that this wasn't even meant to be an attack that killed council members, which in some ways made it a very ineffective tactic, once again framing Jinx's attack on the council as her lashing out. And then comes episode 4 of season 2, where Jinx becomes the face of revolutionary rumblings in Zaun. Except that plot goes exactly nowhere, and not even Jinx wants to be a part of it. Well, where it goes is a distasteful montage of police violence, but, you know. Oh, and then there was also the scene in this episode where Jinx trades some MCU humor with enforcers instead of, killing them like she would if this were season 1, but that's both because the show needed to make the enforcers look better, and it needed to soften Jinx. Jinx breaks people out of Stillwater, but then the revolutionary plot is well and truly killed when Warwick shows up. This is the show telling us in no uncertain terms that it does not care about actually portraying a Zaunite revolution, or even the conflict between Zaun and Piltover. However, where season 2 truly gets egregious, where Jinx's character is concerned, other than everything with Isha, which is its own brand of fucking awful that has nothing to do with political commentary, is in episode 8, when Jinx hallucinates Silco, who says this to her.
Oh, it's a hell of a place. It says something about the late Marcus that he found imprisoning your sister to be a greater mercy than killing her.
Killing isn't mercy.
A spark of rebellion still burns inside that husk, I see. No. Killing is a cycle. One that started long before Vander and me, and that will continue long after the two of you.
I'm done running in circles.
We build our own prisons. Bars forged of oaths, codes, commitments, walls of self-doubt and accepted limitation. We inhabit these cells, these identities, and call them us. I thought I could break free by eliminating those I deemed my jailers. But Jinx, I think the cycle only ends when you find the will to walk away.
Not only does the show somehow mischaracterize Silco from beyond the grave, but it also expects us to take the hallucinations of a suicidal person at face value. Jinx initially takes this to mean she should kill herself. And yet the show wants us to think that this is a correct thing to think. This speech says, in no uncertain terms, that marginalized people should choose peace with their oppressors instead of fighting against them. That is exactly what it says. Apparently, revolutionary struggle is a prison, and the violence of the oppressed and the violence of the oppressors are equivalent. What a centrist ethos this is. Seriously, print this out and put it on the wall of the liberal world headquarters, because this is it right here. This speech is fucking disgusting, because at the end of the show, we see that Jinx does break the cycle by walking away, letting everyone think she is dead. This is why the show gives us the shitty message that Vi and Jinx can never be happy together, which is why they had to kill Vi off in the alternate timeline, which is fucking bullshit. But before I get sidetracked by focusing on how shitty that ending is from a character standpoint for Jinx, Vi, and Ekko's characters, let me instead focus on the fact that this show is seriously trying to put all of the blame, all of the onus of an entire system of oppression on the shoulders of one marginalized individual. Are you fucking serious? This speech, then, makes it clear that the show was never in support of Jinx's attack against Piltover, or anything Silco did in any way. Again, apparently this abstract idea of peace, which truly only means peace for the oppressors, is what is important, not liberation for the marginalized. This show is centrist. And I still have so many more characters to go. Well, since I chatted about Jinx, it's time to chat about Silco. I don't have too much more to add about him individually that I haven't already touched on. Silco was undoubtedly a villain in Season 1, but it was his nuance that gave the show leftist promise. However, once Season 2 premiered, especially once that accursed Episode 8 rolled around, it was clear that the show never wanted him to be anything more than villainous. Even his desire for independence from Piltover was demonized, or perhaps because it was him wanting independence it was demonized. Hard to tell, and the show certainly does not care about delineating the difference. The centrist narrative failed Silco by removing his complexity. The speech from Season 2, Episode 8, of course, removes his complexity as someone who still thinks they dream of liberation for Zaun, and the rest of the season removes the complexity of Shimmer, which in turn removes some of Silco's complexity as well. Silco invested in the creation of Shimmer so that he could use it to empower Zaunites in the fight against Piltover. According to what he tells Vander in Season 1, Episode 3, it was meant to scare Piltover so that they wouldn't cross into the Undercity again. Shimmer is Zaun's only weapon against Piltover. It is also supposed to be a source of economic growth, as Silco makes an enterprise of it. However, Shimmer is also Silco's tool for controlling the Undercity, given that it is an addictive drug, and he can give Shimmer to the enforcers of his will. So Shimmer acts both as a tool for liberation from Piltover and oppression towards Zaun. Things are even further complicated when Episode 6 shows us that Shimmer is Zaun's only real and reliable form of medical intervention. Season 1 does a great job at highlighting the complexity of Shimmer. However, the centrism of the show still arises here, as we never actually see Shimmer being used against Piltover, but only against Zaunites. And while, again, this could have been commentary on the corruption of Silco's mission, the show does not play it that way in the end, especially once Season 2 forgets about the complexity of the substance altogether. Shimmer production is dismantled with very little fanfare, and we see none of the consequences this has for Zaun. The show can't even bother to go through with its centrist narrative and tell us that getting rid of Shimmer benefited Zaun. That's how little it actually cared about Zaun by the end. How insulting. Speaking of insulting, I have very recently learned that Silco's character was based on the anti-Semitic stereotype of Svengali, which, as you might remember, was also written in Christian Link's pitch for the show. I've generally decided to stay away from discussing some of the forms of bigotry in this show, just so that I could keep this video focused, but I feel like this is worth mentioning because of how it demonstrates that there was no thought with Silco other than making him a flat-out villain. The quote here also shows that Vander was supposed to be the heroic character, yet again a far cry from the tragic fallen revolutionary character Leftist interpreted his character as. Also, I think people should know the things that they're watching have disgusting things in them like this, but this detail does tie back into my thesis as well. As I've said before, Sevika is one of the show's most leftist characters, and she is also one of the show's least understood, and there are at least two, but more than likely at least three, reasons for this. First is that Arcane itself barely knows what it's doing with her, and that was most obvious in Season 2. Second is that they had her turn against Vander, and had Vi, our follow-along character, regard her as a traitor, which Sevika both is and is not, depending on your perspective. And third is that she's a South Asian masculine woman, so no comment. The thing about Sevika is that she is committed to Zaun's liberation, the idea of and reality of it. She is not loyal to people, she is loyal to that idea. That is why she both is and isn't a traitor. Season 1 did show this, but in my opinion it did not show it well enough. The first scene we see of Sevika is her giving Vander one last chance to prove himself to her, and he failed. But we never get Sevika's point of view, so this is something you have to pick up on. If you don't, then she just seems like a traitor since we're of course meant to like Vander. Sevika betrays Vander for Silco because she believes Silco will do what Vander could not by making Topside respect the Undercity. In her eyes, Vander has already betrayed the Undercity. As I've already demonstrated, this is not a perspective the show shares, which is why Sevika is doomed from the beginning. Like Silco, Sevika is villainized. And the problem with Sevika is that the show doesn't give us enough of her for us to know what her politics are. To me, especially once Season 2 rolls around, she seems like someone who generally cares about Zaun and its people. But then, the fact that she participates in flooding the streets with Shimmer doesn't make enough sense, because that is something done by Silco, a person who acts out of fear and hate. While this could mean that my interpretation of Sevika is wrong, which I fully acknowledge it could be, I choose to think of this as a symptom of the show failing to truly engage with revolutionary politics once again. Since it's already so busy demonizing revolutionary politics in the first place, how could it even pretend to understand the intricacies of politics born out of hate versus those born out of love? I just simply do not have faith in the show to understand that. I also believe that if the show had actually been invested in giving political commentary, Sevika would have had a much larger role. That she didn't was just another sign that the show would be going in this centrist direction, a sign that was then proven to be true once Season 2 premiered. Because, other than Vi, Sevika is probably the character failed most directly by the show's commitment to centrism. In Season 2, she attempts to rally Zaun's people together, but she's not much of a leader. This plotline is dropped, and the next time we see her, she's leaving the council room after Jayce's bullshit speech. And then she's with the rest of the Zaunites who came to Piltover's aid because we don't know why. And then her ultimate ending is she gets a seat on the council where she looks deeply unhappy and the rest of the council look at her in disdain. And this is supposed to be a good ending? Either the writers forgot or didn't care that Sevika can and probably will be voted out by the other members of the council. Somehow, Sevika, one of the people most vocal about liberation for Zaun, has become a liberal without any time spent on this whatsoever. Zaun here is not liberated in any possible way. My assumption is that Arcane is trying to have us believe that Zaun is on the path to becoming the Zaun of the alternate timeline in Season 2, Episode 7, but as I already explained in my section covering Ekko, that is liberal bullshit that makes no sense. What? Mel? Yes, Mel too is failed as a character by Arcane's commitment to centrism, albeit in a more indirect way than some of the characters I've discussed so far. There were many interesting things about Mel in Season 1, but one of them was that she was easily one of the most decent people on the council. What made Mel interesting when it came to the Piltover and Zaun conflict is that unlike other Piltovians espousing the abstract liberal idea of peace that only applies to protecting their own asses, Mel is an actual pacifist who is committed to peace because she has seen war, being from the war-hungry nation of Noxus, with the general Ambessa as her mother, with whom she has a strained relationship. This, of course, is still a peace that rests upon the exploitation of Zaunites, which is something that Mel appears to accept, perhaps because she has only ever seen war from the side of the victors. She votes for the peace proposal at the end of Season 1, taking off the ring designating her as a Medarda, which is meant to represent her casting aside her family legacy to commit to peace. But again, as I've already said before, this peace is merely one for Piltover, not for Zaun, who would struggle under Silco's rule. What Season 1 did was provide a setup for a Season 2 where Mel actually was forced to contend with her complicity with Piltover's oppression of Zaun, something that could have come in the aftermath of the attack against the Council. Mel is the richest person in Piltover, she benefits from Zaun's exploitation, and while her desire for peace is not nearly as self-absorbed as other Piltovians, it could have been very interesting for Mel to contend with what peace really means and what she is willing to sacrifice to have it, a mirror and foil to the kind of rhetoric we've heard Vander say about what you're willing to sacrifice in war. Of course, Season 2 never followed through on any of this, because that would require the show to actually want to make left-leaning political commentary. Instead, after she gets to pay a little lip service to her well-known stance on peace and diplomacy, Mel is completely removed from the Piltover and Zaun setting. This is a mistake that also was one of the contributors to Ambessa's plotline falling flat. Mel is instead given a plotline that is absolutely devoid of any political commentary whatsoever, which is a complete disservice to her character and everything she represented in Season 1. This is one of the few instances where I can't even say that the show was telegraphing this trajectory in Season 1, because even though we did see her glowing magic at the end of Season 1, Mel's plotline comes completely out of left field. Ambessa telling Mel that her brother was killed after crossing the wrong man just turns out to be an entire lie, which just feels like wasted dialogue. Mel's mage heritage is only hinted at in literally the final 5 seconds of Season 1. Her setup is abandoned because she became a League of Legends champion and her character was simply a teaser for all the Noxus content we'll be getting in the future, I guess. Mel's sidelining is even more egregious when you consider how the big bad of the show, in a way, was Hextech, the very thing that Mel played a large part in developing and spreading, even if she wasn't on the science end of it. Now, in this case, Mel was sidelined because the show couldn't stop itself from leaning into the disposable black girlfriend trope, and none of this has to do with the politics of the show, other than the fact that when Zaun and Piltover was abandoned, so was any hope for Mel getting a good storyline. Hoo boy, where do I even begin with Viktor? I never had any strong feelings about Viktor as a character, but the way Season 2 did him made me very angry. Another character assassinated by the show's centrist narrative, Viktor ends up being our big bad. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with Viktor in Season 1, since I haven't talked about him at all yet. In Season 1, Viktor is an idealist who wants to improve the lives of everyone using technology, specifically Hextech. We don't actually learn that Viktor's from the undercity until Episode 6, but we get hints towards it, such as his dedication to help people in the undercity specifically. There is very little to say about Viktor in the ways of the show's centrist politics, in Season 1 that is. There are small things, though. For example, in Episode 4, when Jayce and Viktor are showing off the inventions they've come up with to help miners in the fissures do their jobs, one might ask why wouldn't they invent anything to help with the fumes from the fissures? Viktor would know that that is a problem. Because of how small of a detail this is, half of me believes that the writers did not consider it, while the other half thinks that maybe it was because, as these are inventions to be shown off to investors, Viktor at least knew that no Piltovian would be buying something to improve the life quality of Zaunites, but would only care about their work productivity. But again, even if we do make this interpretation, Arcane never showed it, and we have to think about why that is. If the writers did not consider it, then that would indicate a lack of engagement with their own setting. If they did think of this, but still chose not to show it, then that would mean that they found it to be an irrelevant detail to include. For a detail like this to be irrelevant, I can only assume that means that they did not want to show Piltovians being unconcerned with the quality of life in Zaun. Once again, Piltover is distanced from its exploitation of Zaun. But of course, a lot of what I just said here is conjecture, so you can take it all with a grain of salt. Season 2 removes Viktor from the political context that leads him to become who he is in that season, and that is where many of the problems begin, at least when it comes to what little the show gives us of the Piltover and Zaun conflict in Season 2. Everything that leads Viktor to becoming the big bad is Piltover's fault. Viktor's terminal illness is because of the Grey, which is a byproduct of Piltover's industry in the fissures. Viktor set up a commune in the former homeless encampment because of Piltover. Remember, Zaun hardly has any medical treatments, and with Shimmer gone, Viktor is all they have. And remember that Vi directly implied that the homeless encampment specifically is the fault of Piltover. Hell, Viktor fucking died in Jinx's attack against the Council, an attack that was because of Piltover, despite what the show wants us to think. And despite the fact that Viktor creating the commune is inherently a political act, it is never treated as such. Viktor's thoughts on doing this are never explored other than some vague Jesus allegory bullshit. He doesn't do it because Zaun is his home and it has been mistreated, he does it because there are people there who need help. The role of Piltover in creating this problem is not mentioned whatsoever, unlike in Season 1, where Vi at least points this out to Caitlyn. But lines like that feel cheap when we never get any follow-up action, it's just paying lip service. Piltover created the final villain out of Viktor, just like how Mbessa was only a threat because of Piltover's treatment of the undercity, and the show never ever addresses this in any way. Instead, we get this bullshit we're all one people type of speech from Jayce, and Zaun ends up turning the tide to win the war. Piltover is never forced to deal with the consequences of its own actions. It wins the war, it remains in power, they lose absolutely nothing at the end of the show. Frankly, I'm not convinced that the people behind the show even thought about Piltover's role in creating Viktor, unless they were trying to go for some bullshit like we both created this villain with Piltover being the impetus and Zaun's only contribution being that Viktor is a Zaunite, but I'm gonna hope that the writers would not go for something that horribly offensive. Even I think that is a rather uncharitable reading of the situation. Another aspect of Viktor that in the end screams of the show's centrism is that the final villain is a hive mind. Western media hates the idea of a hive mind because it conflicts with the individualism we are taught to cherish. Therefore, the final villain being a hive mind is a rather obvious display of liberal values. It is also rather boring, given that it has no symbolic meaning for the central themes of the show, but we already know that Arcane Season 2 is a failure of television, so no need to talk about that. Although I dislike Jayce as a character, I don't actually have much to say about him for this video. By the end of the show, Jayce is like the only character with a halfway decent arc, probably because he's Christian Link's self-insert. But anyway, since the centrism with Jayce is not as strong, this section will be short, except for when I talk about that accursed episode Season 2, Episode 8. We'll get there though. Where the centrism shines most with Jayce is that his own lack of a moral backbone, a key characteristic of most moderates, is never condemned by the show. Jayce flip-flops all the time. It's one of his defining character traits at this point. He doesn't want Hextech weaponized, then he talks to Mel and Mbessa and suddenly he's all for it and is ready to raid a Shimmer factory with Vi. Except oops, that ended with a dead child, and now Jayce wants to wash his hands of his responsibility for that and all the other Zaunite children that have died from the Council's inaction. After the Council attack though, he's perfectly fine making Hextech weapons again, and more of them this time. If Arcane was truly committed to providing left-leaning commentary, Jayce would be called out for his lack of a moral backbone and the way that he tries to wipe his hands clean of the horror that he and the rest of the Council have allowed to fester in Zaun because of their neglect and prejudice. But he is not called out, not once. The only time he is remotely called out on anything is when he shows prejudice towards Zaunites in Season 1, except in the end, both Viktor and Vi pay only lip service to the idea that Jayce's prejudice is wrong, and that's the end of it. Jayce receives no repercussions. The prejudice Jayce exhibits is there for interpersonal tension, not political commentary. In Season 2, Rennie, the mother of the boy that Jayce killed in the Shimmer factory, and a few chem tanks attack the memorial service for the dead counselors, a direct consequence of Jayce killing Rennie's son. But this is never addressed, so instead of Arcane taking this opportunity to discuss the consequences of Jayce's actions and his privilege in allowing to get away with them, instead we get a scene that is meant to further Caitlyn's arc, and Rennie and the chem tanks are simply framed as monsters to be killed rather than people. This demonstrates the show's own prejudice towards Zaunites like Rennie and those that engage in the Shimmer trade, since outside of Silco, where this is only barely discussed, Piltover's role in creating people like Rennie is not highlighted. Again, it is as if the show is trying to put Piltover and Zaun on an equal playing field, despite the fact that it has already established that they are not on one at all. And then there is, of course, Season 2, Episode 8, where Jayce gives the worst speech known to man, the speech that, along with Silco's speech in the same episode, wraps up all of Arcane's centrist politics in a nice, neat little bow for us. How convenient. This speech, and Episode 8 and 9 in general, give us the trope of two enemies coming together to defeat a greater evil. And that can be a really great trope when the enemies aren't the oppressor and the oppressed. Because now what the show is trying to tell us is the struggles of the marginalized aren't important right now. We have bigger things to address. It's the same bullshit I've heard over and over again in certain organizing spaces. Oh, can you quiet down about anti-blackness? It's causing disunity and we're trying to fight against XYZ. Like, no, it's your anti-blackness that's causing the disunity. Just like how it's Piltover's treatment of Zaun that not only is leaving them as a divided front against the final villains, but also it is what allowed those villains to be created in the first place. Like the bullshit killing is a cycle speech, Jayce's speech places the burden on the marginalized, this time to make good with their oppressors so they can defeat a greater evil. Piltover sacrifices absolutely nothing in this, and yet Zaun is asked to put its own people on the line. His speech also uses the insulting "we are all one people" kind of rhetoric, a rhetoric made more insulting when we know that Jayce is someone who holds prejudicial attitudes towards Zaunites. Jayce's speech demonstrates why Arcane Season 2's focus on the arcane, the focus that everyone complains took up too much time, is just a consequence of the show's centrism, not the cause of it. To execute its centrist message, the show needed this big bad for Piltover and Zaun to unite against. I wasn't going to give Heimerdinger his own section, I was just going to talk about him during Ekko's, but I decided to discuss Heimerdinger separately because I think that he represents the show's centrism in a couple of different ways. Unlike almost every other character, other than Jayce I guess, Heimerdinger wasn't failed by the show's centrism other than not receiving the consequences he needed to. See, as I said earlier, Heimerdinger is deeply complicit in Zaun's oppression, given that he helped found Piltover and has been there ever since. And yet, the show tries to pass this off as Heimerdinger didn't know. When he gets booted off of the council, he goes to the undercity, and that's when he hears of how bad things are down there. Considering he was head of the council, that is utter bullshit, and his apparent lack of knowledge is not cute or quirky, unlike what the show wants us to believe. This idea that those who engage in oppression are ignorant is a liberal one, by the way. Somehow, Heimerdinger of all characters is the only Piltovian to actually try to do anything to help Zaun, in theory. Personally, I believe that one of the reasons why Zaun had its happy ending in the Season 2 Episode 7 AU is because of Heimerdinger having those 3 years there, where he could have gotten the council to do more or just gone down to the undercity himself. The show doesn't tell us any of this, since, as my friend Malvi always likes to say, Arcane Season 2 is a show you imagine, not watch. And even if it is true that Heimerdinger was helping out Zaun in those 3 years, I hope the show isn't expecting me to think that 3 years is anywhere near enough to make up for 3 centuries of complicity, because it's not. But of course, if Arcane did actually intend for us to think that Heimerdinger was helping Zaun for 3 years, then they probably do think that he'd earned his redemption by then, which is why he dies helping Ekko get back to the main universe. Y'all thought you'd get through this video without me highlighting even more of the other bullshit that was the final battle? Ha! Think again. No, because I have to talk about what is quite possibly the most insulting ending in all of Arcane, which is that of Gert, a side character with hardly any lines in Season 2. In Season 2, we see that Gert is a Jinxer, so one of Zaun's mini-revolutionaries. She gets thrown into still water like many people at the Episode 4 rally. We also see her in the Season 2 Episode 7 alternate timeline where she works at the last drop, showing that she is very involved in her community. And then... bullshit. At first, Gert is ready to get the hell out of town after talks of war, and she is rightfully angry when an enforcer touches her, an enforcer we're supposed to feel bad for based on the expression, which is just infuriating. Gert then changes her mind and goes to help Piltover when she sees an enforcer helping an old lady? I have interpretations of this that at least attempt to be reasonable and not centrist, but I'm sure what the show had in mind was something like Gert sees that the enforcers and therefore Piltovians are people too, and so she should fight with them, or some bullshit like that. As if it is Gert's job as a member of the oppressed class to forgive and forget with her oppressors. Fuck that shit. But that's, of course, not the worst part of all this, because the next time we see Gert is after Vi carries her to relative safety in the middle of the war, and she dies while holding Vi's hand, while in enforcer uniform, the uniform of her oppressors. Gert, the revolutionary, died fighting for and in the uniform of her oppressors.
What the flim-flam?
The fuck is this? Like, legitimately, what the fuck am I supposed to make of this? Shit like this is exactly why I hate liberals. In the end, how is this not the exploitation of Zaunites taken a different form? Gert giving up the revolutionary struggle just to die for the people that have oppressed and enacted violence onto her people for centuries? Are you fucking serious right now? What do they want us to get from this? What message are they trying to send? Because I can glean nothing positive from this whatsoever, but given that the show is indeed centrist, clearly what I'm getting is not what they wanted me to get. I believe that this is supposed to be an extension of the we're all one people fighting against a common enemy nonsense, and that's it. That's why Vi is the one to watch Gert die and is so affected by it, because she's shocked that another Zaunite came to help the fight, since they of course wrote that out-of-character liberal bullshit about Vi for some reason being mad that Jinx wouldn't help with the fight. It's supposed to be an emotional moment showing that all these people came together. It's a moment of tragic unity. And the moment is tragic, but not for any of these reasons. To me, I watched this scene and I'm devastated that this kind-hearted woman died for her oppressors. I'm devastated that Vi has to watch another one of her people die right in front of her after Gert reached out for her, the fellow Zaunite who tried to save her. If the show hadn't ended by severing all of Vi's ties to Zaun, this moment could have easily acted as the wake-up call that Season 2 Vi needed to get her head out of her ass and get the fuck out of Piltover when Season 2 ended, because to me, it symbolizes a moment between two Zaunites who realize they are expendable to Piltover. But of course, the show intended absolutely none of this. Unfortunately for Arcane, Leftists just write better stories. One of the most interesting things about Arcane's second season has less to do with the show and rather with what the content of the season revealed about its own fanbase. In having its centrism laid bare, Arcane's second season revealed the centrism and even conservatism of its fanbase. There is a reason why someone tweeted that Arcane Season 2 has done more for the right than Trump. Never before have I wanted to say, do you fucking hear yourself, with such a high frequency as I have since Arcane Season 2 premiered. This section of the video is going to be highlighting some of the absolutely ridiculous and absurd bullshit rhetoric I've come across in the Arcane fandom, specifically on Twitter, in the last few months. Given that all of these tweets were made on public accounts, I've decided not to blur out usernames, but I'd like to make it clear that those viewing should not go harass these users. I'm bringing these tweets up to talk about a broader trend in this fandom space, not because I have beef with specific people. Understand? Great! For one thing, Arcane Season 2 has given people the gall to defend or downplay the use of gas weaponry. Excuse me, the fuck? I'd like to think that gas weapons are a bad thing for most people, but apparently not. Since the show didn't give Caitlyn, or Vi, but Vi got punished anyway, shit for using the gas, despite it being pretty visually obvious using the gas was bad, parts of the fanbase seem to believe it's not bad either. Many people justify it by saying that it's fine for this brutality to be used against criminals, feeding right back into the prejudicial and dehumanizing rhetoric that Christian Link used in his pitch for the show. Arcane fans have also revealed their disdain for revolutionary actions on the part of the oppressed, demonizing them the same way the show demonizes Zaunite revolutionary actions. Seems more of these people are okay with oppression than they'd have you think. Many of them also just parrot centrist rhetoric as well. And many of these are truly just so ridiculous. Like, no shit, revolutions are bloody things. They're the result of systematic violence done onto a group of people. The fuck? All this reform nonsense is giving me a headache. Some people continue to use the same roll over and take it rhetoric the show adopts. No wonder y'all sound like Zionists. I've seen someone justify if Isha was collateral damage because it's a very normal thing to be okay with a 7-year-old child being shot in the head. I've seen people make up shit that did not happen in the show just so they could be angry at leftist fans for being upset at the show's centrism. I've seen people mock a Palestinian fan for finding very obvious connections between how Caitlyn is portrayed in Season 2 and the Zionist occupation of Palestine. This one isn't very surprising since Arcane and shows like it are thinly veiled Zionist, colonial, imperialist propaganda, which is why they demonize revolutionaries. I've seen people dismiss the inherent violence of policing as something only experienced in the United States when that is factually not true, not to mention most of these people sound anti-black as fuck. I have even seen someone try to use Frantz Fanon, the decolonial theorist, to justify liberal rhetoric. You truly cannot make this shit up. For God's sakes, someone pulled out Ronald Reagan, Ronald crack cocaine war on drugs Reagan, to talk about the scene where Vi and Jayce talk after Jayce kills Rennie's son. Please get serious very fast. I don't even know how to caption some of these other tweets, so I'll just show them to you and I'll let y'all come to your own conclusions about the state of the fanbase. Oh, and fun bonus before I get serious again, here's some of the responses I got to my tweet that kind of blew up saying that Arcane was always going to be centrist. Honestly, it's kind of funny looking at them now. Man, some of y'all were really mad over 11 words. I'm not even gonna go into how anti-black the Arcane fandom on Twitter has been. Instead, I'll just let y'all read some of the tweets I'm putting up here right now, because we'll be here all day if I truly get into it. Essentially, it's important to understand that the Arcane fandom has continually revealed itself to be just as racist as Trump supporters because the show has the same rhetoric that Trump supporters and centrists use. So, perhaps most ironic is the fact that much of Arcane's fan base act just like the show they ride so hard for, performing leftist politics while actually being a centrist at best. So many of the most egregious tweets and takes that I've seen have come from people with BLM or Free Palestine in their bios, a red triangle in their name, or some other indication of alliance with a leftist movement or thought. Well, BLM isn't leftist, but you get the idea. Leftism stays being co-opted by liberalism because that is how it is defanged and defeated. That's the more insidious side of a show like Arcane. If we consider Arcane left, then we continue to push ourselves further and further to the right, which is something the world is already doing. It's something this fan base is doing. Somehow, despite using conservative and centrist talking points to the point where they sound like Trumpites or Zionists, these same people believe that Arcane is a left-leaning progressive show. This is, quite frankly, dangerous. This is the rhetoric that allows for the world to continue shifting to the right. This is the rhetoric that has allowed for genocides to take place across the globe. This is the rhetoric that has allowed for people to seriously believe the United States is not a fascist country. This is the rhetoric that has allowed for millions to die due to COVID-19 because you refuse to wear a mask. This is the kind of rhetoric that has us on the precipice of another pandemic with bird flu. I wonder if me pointing this out just made some of you watching change your opinions on this video. Am I being too sensitive for you? Too woke? Since you've allowed the right wing to take that term and twist it from its original meaning since you started using it as a joking insult. The rightward shift of the world is not something that exists in a vacuum. We are all a part of it. And as Arcane shows, as long as centrist and right-wing messaging is given by sources you can latch onto and enjoy, you don't fucking care. I want this video to be the last time I even think of Arcane, to be honest. I hated Season 2, and all I've been able to think about, with the exception of the day that I binged Castlevania Nocturne Season 2, which was excellent, is this fucking show, and I'm tired of it. One thing I'd like is to never engage with the fandom, beyond the small group of people I actually like on Twitter and Discord, ever again, because I've been very disappointed with what I've seen. This fandom continually loses sight of the fact that Arcane is a fictional show. By that I mean people always argue over characters when they need to be arguing over the writing. Arguing about characters obfuscates the writing that led to these character decisions and the intentions that got us here in the first place. That's one of the reasons why I made this video. I no longer entertain arguments about characters doing this, that, and the other, not about Arcane, because to me the writer's bias is so damn obvious. It probably helps that my favorite character was the one done the dirtiest in many ways, so I was angry and looking for a reason as to why she was done so horribly. And I've found it. I hate it. I want to never experience a work of these writers again. I'll probably never pick up a League of Legends related product again, which was my mistake in the first place. But at least I found the reason, and maybe I could find some sort of comfort in that. Thank you all so much for watching. I've never made a video this long before, and it was very, very exhausting. This is also very different to what I normally put out here on YouTube. I am literally a reviewer of SpongeBob SquarePants. That's all I do. And I guess now I can say that I rant about Centrism and Arcane for 2 hours as well. At least now I can finally get back to my life, instead of hyperfixating on this show 24/7, because while I can't control my hyperfixations, I have a feeling that a big project like this is exactly what my brain needed to finally let it go. Vi and Ekko, I'll love y'all forever, and now it's time for me to drop this show. For good.